Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. It starts with a question. Have you ever heard something that makes you doubt your own mind? A sound that seems real, but somehow out of place, too strange to ignore yet too subtle to explain? Every night, just as the world outside falls into silence, the noises begin. At first, it's nothing more than a faint, mechanical hum. I thought it was just the pipes. Maybe a loose part rattling against the wall, a simple fault in the building's old system. But then the sounds grow sharper, clearer, and it becomes something more, something sinister. The first time I heard it, I woke in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling. The humming was still there, but now it was accompanied by the distinct clanking of metal, like gears grinding together. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, and the rhythm was oddly mechanical, like a clock ticking in reverse. I checked the time, 2 a.m. Everything outside my window was calm, the streetlights casting long shadows on the empty street below. But inside, there was a strange, almost electric tension in the air. I told myself it was nothing. The building was old, and buildings make noises. But that night, the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more pronounced, like something was moving behind the wall, something mechanical. It wasn't just pipes. It wasn't just wind. It was deliberate. The next morning, I bumped into my neighbor, Mr. Malden, in the hallway. He's a quiet man, a little reclusive, always with his head down as if trying to avoid any interaction. He lives in the apartment next door, the one that shares the wall where the sound seems to come from. I hesitated but asked anyway. Mr. Malden, do you know anything about some noises at night? It sounds like something's running behind the wall. He looked at me for a second, then slowly shook his head. No, I haven't heard anything like that. You're probably just hearing things. His voice was low, almost dismissive. I wanted to press him, ask if he had old machinery or anything that might make those sounds. But there was something in his eyes, a kind of coldness, that stopped me. So, I just nodded and walked away, wondering why he seemed so certain. Why would he be so quick to deny it? That night, the noises came again. This time, they were louder. The hum became a drone, steady and deep, and the clanking metal sounded like it was getting closer. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. There was something wrong about it, something I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the sounds, it was the feeling that something was behind them. Something, waiting. I got up, walked to the wall, and placed my ear against it. The noise was deafening now, like a machine working at full capacity, its gears turning relentlessly. My mind raced. I wondered if there was some kind of secret passage behind the wall, some hidden space I didn't know about. Was Mr. Malden hiding something? The sounds kept me up all night, growing louder and more intense. At some point, I couldn't tell if I was hearing them from the wall or from inside my own head. But when dawn finally broke and the noise faded away, I was left with an unsettling silence and an even deeper sense of unease. The next day, I decided to ask Mr. Malden again. Maybe he had just been pretending not to know. Maybe he was hiding something. But when I knocked on his door, there was no answer. I waited, knocking again and again, but still nothing. I stood there for a long time, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Something felt off. I could hear movement inside, a faint shuffle, like someone was walking around, but the door remained locked. I thought about calling the landlord, but what could I even say? That my neighbor was acting strange, and I was hearing sounds from behind the wall? I decided to let it go, at least for now. But that night, when the clock struck 2, I knew it wouldn't. The sounds returned, even more persistent than before. Only this time, I couldn't ignore them. The noise wasn't just mechanical anymore. It was deliberate. And it was closer than ever. I spent the next few nights in a constant state of alert. Each evening, as the darkness settled, I found myself listening for that sound, dreading its return. But by the third night, something changed. The noise wasn't just mechanical anymore. It was rhythmic. The clanking of metal, the hum of a machine, it started to take on a pattern, as if whatever was behind the wall had a purpose. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was calling me, or perhaps taunting me. Every night, it grew more insistent, more urgent. And no matter how much I tried to block it out, the sound seemed to be coming from deeper within the walls, as though they were coming from somewhere beneath the apartment, crawling up toward me. I had to know what was going on. I waited until the noise reached its peak, the gears grinding, the hum vibrating through my bones, before I grabbed a flashlight and approached the wall. My hand trembled as I traced the cracks, the uneven plaster, wondering if there was a hidden doorway. My mind raced. Maybe there was something down there, something I didn't know about. Maybe the building itself was hiding a secret. I pressed my ear against the wall again, and this time I heard it more clearly. Not just metal on metal, but something else, a low, guttural sound. Almost like breathing. It was coming from the same spot, just inches beneath the surface. I jumped back, heart racing, a cold sweat running down my spine. There was someone, or something, on the other side of the wall. I couldn't deny it anymore. The sound wasn't just a machine. It was alive. But I couldn't be sure. My mind, frayed with lack of sleep and fear, started playing tricks on me. I remembered what Mr. Malden had said. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was losing my mind. But as I stood there, I felt the walls closing around me. The air grew thick, heavy with tension, and the hum intensified. I couldn't tell if it was the house groaning under the weight of years or if it was something else, something more sinister. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to confront him, Mr. Malden. I had to ask him again, and this time I wouldn't let him deny it. I knocked on his door once more, but this time I wasn't just asking. I was demanding. No answer came, so I knocked harder, my fist pounding against the wood. I heard footsteps inside, slow and deliberate, and then the door creaked open. Mr. Malden stood there, as stoic and cold as ever, but there was something different about him. His eyes were dark, almost hollow, and his face was pale, as though he hadn't slept in days. He looked at me without speaking, waiting for me to break the silence. "Please," I said, my voice shaking. "I need to know what's going on. The noise behind the wall, what is it?" He stared at me for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Then, without a sound, he stepped aside and motioned for me to come in. My heart raced as I entered his apartment. The door clicked shut behind me, and for a moment, I wondered if I'd made a mistake. I tried to steady my breath, but the air in the room was heavy, suffocating, and the sound of the hum seemed to grow louder the closer I got to the wall that separated our apartments. Mr. Malden didn't speak. He simply pointed toward the wall. I turned, my gaze fixed on the spot where the noise had always come from. There was nothing remarkable about it, a plain, ordinary wall with no visible seams or cracks. Yet, as I looked closer, I noticed something. The wall seemed to vibrate just slightly, as if it were alive. And then, the noise changed. The grinding stopped. The hum faded away. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. But the silence didn't last. A soft thump echoed from within the wall, followed by the unmistakable sound of something scraping against the plaster. Something was moving in there. Something large. Something heavy. Before I could react, the wall in front of us cracked, a deep, jagged line running from top to bottom, and the sound of shuffling feet filled the room. My breath caught in my throat. And then I saw it. A figure, dark, indistinct, loomed on the other side of the wall. Mr. Malden didn't flinch. He didn't move. He just stared at the wall, his expression unreadable. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My body went numb. Who is it? I whispered, barely able to form the words. Mr. Malden's lips curled into a twisted smile. It's not who. It's what. The figure behind the wall moved again, the scraping sound growing louder, closer, until I felt the floor beneath me vibrate with the force of it. And then the wall gave way, crumbling like dust, revealing what was hidden inside. I staggered backward, my heart racing in my chest, my body paralyzed with fear. What I saw was beyond anything I could have imagined. The wall collapsed in front of me with a thunderous crack, sending a cloud of dust into the air. My eyes stung as I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my throat. I could barely breathe, overwhelmed by the suffocating weight of terror that pressed down on me. At first, I saw only shadows, a mass of tangled shapes that loomed beyond the debris. It was difficult to make sense of what I was looking at, my mind refusing to process it. But as the dust settled, I could see more clearly, just enough to understand that whatever was on the other side of the wall wasn't human. The figure, or rather, the mass, was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and thin, twisting unnaturally in ways they shouldn't. The surface of its body seemed to ripple, like something was moving beneath its skin. The edges of its form blurred, as if it were a shadow that didn't belong in the room, something from the corners of my mind brought to life. It wasn't a person, not in any sense I could understand. Its features were indistinct, like a silhouette that flickered in and out of existence. The more I stared, the more it seemed to distort, as though it were trying to shape itself into something recognizable, but failing miserably. The noise, the scraping, the thumping, was coming from it. Not from a machine, not from pipes, but from the thing itself, as if its very presence caused the walls to vibrate and groan. My body was frozen, a mixture of shock and primal fear preventing me from moving. And then, as if sensing my gaze, the thing turned its head, or at least, I think it did. Its face remained featureless, but I could feel its eyes on me, invisible yet so intense that it seemed to pierce through my skin. Mr. Malden didn't move. He was standing next to me, still as stone, his expression unchanged. His eyes were focused on the figure, and there was a look of resignation in them. I wanted to scream, to ask him what this was, why it was here, but no words came out. The thing in front of us shifted, its limbs contorting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. With each movement, the scraping sound grew louder, more insistent, as if it was trying to force its way into the world. The floor beneath me seemed to tremble with the weight of its presence, and the air grew thick with something unnatural. I couldn't look away. My mind screamed at me to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was rooted to the spot, caught in the grip of whatever this thing was. Finally, Mr. Malden spoke, his voice a low whisper, like he was speaking to himself rather than to me. "It's been here longer than you can imagine," he said. "It was always here, behind the walls, watching, waiting." I turned to him, my voice breaking. "What is it? Why is it here?" Mr. Malden's lips curled into something resembling a smile, though there was no warmth in it. "It's not just in the walls. It's in everything. The sound you hear, it's not a machine. It's the thing reaching out, trying to find a way into this world. It needs to be fed. It needs to." Before he could finish, the thing moved again, its body folding and bending like something made of liquid. The sound of grinding metal filled the air, and the walls around us seemed to buckle, the building groaning as if it were alive, suffocating under the weight of this presence. The thing's form seemed to pulse, like it was drawing energy from the very space around it. The floor beneath me cracked, a deep, jagged fracture splitting the room in two. I could hear the walls around us beginning to buckle as if they were being pulled inward, like the entire building was being consumed. I took a step back, my eyes wide in panic, but Mr. Malden remained rooted to the spot. His expression had changed, his face twisted in a mix of sorrow and inevitability. "It's too late," he whispered. "It's already started." A loud crack echoed through the room as a piece of the ceiling collapsed, sending debris tumbling to the floor. The thing's form surged forward, reaching out with impossibly long arms. I could feel the temperature drop, a coldness creeping through the air like a winter wind. I turned, desperate to escape, but the door was gone. The entire room, the entire apartment, had transformed into a cavern, a hollowed-out shell, with the thing at its center. I could feel its presence pressing in from every direction, as if the very walls were closing in, suffocating me. And then it reached for me. Its fingers were thin, long, and cold, stretching impossibly far until one of them brushed against my cheek. The touch sent a shock through my body, an icy wave that left me paralyzed. My mind screamed, but I couldn't move. The world around me seemed to distort, the edges blurring, and the only thing I could focus on was the thing's touch. I had no idea what it wanted. I had no idea what it was, but in that moment, I realized something. This wasn't just a neighbor. This wasn't just a strange sound behind the wall. This was something far older, far more dangerous than anything I could comprehend. And I was trapped with it. I closed my eyes, waiting for the inevitable, but the thing's grip never tightened. The pressure on my body remained. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the sensation was gone. I opened my eyes. The thing was gone. The room was back to normal, the walls intact, the silence overwhelming. But I could still feel it. And I knew that it wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The silence was deafening. I stood there in the middle of the room, heart pounding in my chest, my legs trembling beneath me. I had no idea what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Had it been a nightmare? But everything around me was real, the walls, the floor, the debris scattered across the room from the collapsed ceiling. And yet, the presence was still there. I could feel it, lurking in the corners of the room, just out of sight. I glanced around, expecting to see the thing in the shadows, but there was nothing. It was as though the entire building had exhaled a breath it had been holding for too long, and now everything had returned to an eerie stillness. But I knew. Deep down, I knew it wasn't gone. The wall, the one that had cracked open, was perfectly intact again. No signs of the destruction I had witnessed moments before. It was as if nothing had happened. As if the thing hadn't just reached out to touch me. Mr. Malden was still standing there, motionless. He hadn't moved an inch since the thing's disappearance, but his eyes were different now, darker, more hollow, as if he'd seen the thing more times than he cared to admit. He looked at me, but there was no pity in his gaze, no concern. Only a strange acceptance, like he knew exactly what was happening and was powerless to stop it. I wanted to ask him what it all meant, why he had let this thing exist, why he had brought me into this nightmare. But when I opened my mouth, no words came out. "It's watching," Mr. Malden said softly, his voice a mere whisper in the thick air. "It's always watching. It has been for years, decades, maybe even longer. And now, it knows you can see it." The coldness in his voice sent a shiver down my spine. He wasn't scared. No, it was something worse. He was resigned. He had accepted the presence of the thing. But why? What does it want from us? I finally managed to ask, my voice hoarse. Mr. Malden turned his gaze toward the wall, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something like fear in his eyes. But it was fleeting, gone as soon as it appeared. "It wants more than we can give," he replied, almost to himself. "It feeds on us, on our fear. It's not just here, not just in the walls. It's in the very air we breathe. It's always been around us, hidden in the cracks, in the spaces between moments. And now, it has found you." I took a step back, my mind racing. "What do you mean, it found me?" His eyes fixed on mine. "You've heard it. You've felt it. That's enough. Once it notices you, it won't stop until it's satisfied." The walls seemed to pulse around me. My heart was hammering in my chest, a wild, erratic rhythm that seemed to echo the vibrations in the air. I didn't know what to do, where to go. I wanted to run, to escape this place, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Something kept me tethered, kept me in that room with Mr. Malden and the unseen thing that lurked just beyond my vision. Suddenly, the hum started again. Faint at first, then louder, growing steadily until it was impossible to ignore. The scraping followed, like metal dragging against stone. It was coming from within the walls again. But now, it was no longer distant. It was right next to me. It was as if the thing had never left. The temperature in the room dropped. I could see my breath fogging in front of me, my body shivering despite the layers of clothing. I was paralyzed with fear. The air felt thick, oppressive, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. "It's too late to escape," Mr. Malden murmured, as if reading my thoughts. "The thing isn't bound by the physical world. It exists between the spaces. Once it finds you, it pulls you into its world. You can't run. You can't hide." I turned to face him, my voice trembling. "How do you know this? How long have you been living with this?" His face twisted with a sadness I hadn't seen before. "Too long," he said quietly. "I've tried to ignore it, to live with it. But it's always there, lurking, waiting for the moment it can reach out." The noise intensified, growing louder, closer, until it was unbearable. The walls seemed to vibrate with it, the floor beneath my feet shaking. I could hear the thing moving again, scraping its way toward us. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. And the silence that followed was worse than the sound. It was the kind of silence that presses on your ears, makes you question whether you've gone deaf, or if the world has just ceased to exist. I turned to Mr. Malden, desperation in my eyes. What do we do? How do we stop it? He looked at me, his expression unreadable. There is no stopping it, he said, his voice low and defeated. You can't kill what doesn't live. You can't fight what you can't see. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to break the stillness that surrounded us. But before I could take another step, the wall behind me cracked again, and I heard a low, guttural sound. This time, I didn't need to see it. I could feel it, the presence behind me, moving closer. It was reaching for me again. But this time, I understood. It wasn't just watching anymore. It was coming for me. The presence behind me grew, suffocating, the weight of it pressing on my chest, filling my lungs with something cold and thick. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It was like drowning in air, in the darkness, in the very silence that had swallowed us whole. I turned, but there was nothing there. The room was still empty, the walls intact, and yet, I could feel it. I could feel it in every inch of the space, in the air, in the way my skin tingled with dread. It was watching, waiting for the right moment. The right crack in the world to slip through. Mr. Malden hadn't moved. His face was ashen, eyes hollow, but there was a strange calmness in him, as if he had already accepted the truth. Perhaps he had even welcomed it, knowing that fighting was futile. But I couldn't accept it. I wouldn't. I stepped back, my heart racing, hands shaking uncontrollably. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to escape, but there was no way out. The door was gone, the windows sealed shut. The room itself felt like a trap, and there was nowhere I could go where the thing wouldn't find me. Suddenly, the air grew colder. The sound, the scraping, started again, louder this time. It was no longer coming from just the walls, it was in the floor, in the ceiling, in the very ground beneath my feet. The building groaned, as though it were alive, and the very fabric of reality seemed to tremble with the thing's presence. I turned to Mr. Malden, my voice trembling. Why are you doing this? What do you want from me? His eyes flickered toward the door, toward the unseen space where the thing was waiting. It doesn't want anything from you, not in the way you think. It doesn't hunger for flesh or for power. It wants only to be seen, to be acknowledged. It feeds on our fear, on our terror, on our belief in it. And once it has you, once it knows you can see it, it won't let you go. I staggered backward, the room shifting with each step. The walls seemed to be closing on me, squeezing the air out of my lungs. I felt a cold, creeping sensation moving up my spine, like icy fingers brushing against my skin. The thing was getting closer. I had to do something. I had to escape, or I would be consumed by it, just like Mr. Malden. But how? I looked around the room, desperate, searching for anything that could give me a way out. And then I saw it. A crack in the wall, small and narrow, almost invisible. It was barely a hairline fracture, but something told me it wasn't just part of the building settling. It was a doorway. The sound grew louder, more frantic, like something was tearing through the space around me. I could feel the thing moving closer, could almost sense it reaching out with its invisible limbs, pulling at the very fabric of the room. My heart raced faster, my chest tight with fear. I had no time left. I rushed toward the crack in the wall, my hands fumbling to tear at the plaster. The walls groaned, the noise escalating as though the building itself was trying to stop me. but I didn't care. I had to get out. I had to escape. The crack widened under my frantic attempts, and suddenly, I was through. The space beyond was pitch black, so dark it seemed to swallow all light. I could hear the thing behind me, still scraping, still moving, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I stumbled forward, my feet slipping on the slick surface beneath me. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, a never-ending void that pulled me deeper into its depths. The sound of the scraping followed, relentless and maddening, like it was right behind me, just an inch away. I didn't know how long I ran. Minutes? Hours? It didn't matter. The darkness consumed me, and with each step, I could feel the thing's presence closing in, suffocating me. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My throat was tight, my body exhausted, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving, had to keep running, even though I knew, deep down, I was only running deeper into its world. And then, just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it. A faint light in the distance, a flicker of something real in the vast emptiness. I ran toward it, my breath ragged, my heart hammering. The scraping, the hum, had stopped, but I could still feel it, its presence, like an unseen weight pressing against my chest. I reached the light, and suddenly, I was back in the room. The one with Mr. Malden. The walls were whole again, the air still, the space eerily silent. I turned around, my pulse racing. There was no escape. The thing wasn't gone. It was here. It had followed me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then, in the silence, I heard a whisper. "Welcome back." The darkness closed in. Have you ever felt the strange sensation that something is watching you, even when you're alone? Something just out of sight, lurking in the corners of your vision? I had always dismissed those feelings until one night when I saw it with my own eyes. It started so simply, with nothing more than a flicker. The kind of thing you'd assume was your imagination playing tricks on you, a trick of light or shadow. I had just finished tidying up my bedroom, brushing off the dust from my nightstand, when I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible glow coming from the direction of my dresser. At first, I thought it was just the moonlight spilling through the window, catching the edge of something on top of the dresser. But as I looked closer, I realized it was coming from within the drawer itself. My heart skipped a beat. I had no memory of ever seeing light coming from that drawer. It was an old piece of furniture, a faded wooden dresser with a chipped surface, inherited from my grandmother. The drawer in question had been stuck for as long as I could remember. I had tried to open it countless times, only to find it jammed tight, no matter how much I tugged or pulled. But there it was, the light coming from the crack between the drawer and its frame, casting a soft, eerie glow onto the surface of the dresser. It wasn't bright enough to illuminate the room, but it was enough to make the air feel thick, charged with something strange. I stood frozen, staring at it, unsure what to do. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to just go to bed and forget about what I had seen. But curiosity gnawed at me. The longer I stared at it, the stronger the pull became. There was something about it that felt wrong, but at the same time, I couldn't look away. The sound of the clock ticking in the corner of the room seemed to grow louder, as if it were counting down to something. I took a hesitant step forward, my hand reaching toward the drawer. The light flickered, just for a second, before stabilizing again. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat as I slowly pulled the drawer open. It was just a few inches, enough to see inside. At first, I saw nothing but the shadows cast by the faint light. The drawer was mostly empty, except for a few old, forgotten keepsakes, letters, receipts, a dried flower. Nothing that would explain the glow. And then, nestled at the back of the drawer, I saw it. A postcard. It was simple, almost mundane, like the kind you would send from a vacation. But this one was different. The moment I saw it, a cold shiver ran down my spine. The edges were worn, yellowed with age, but the image on the front was clear, a picture of a quiet, idyllic street in a small town, bathed in the soft glow of twilight. There was nothing remarkable about the image, but it felt familiar. I reached for it, my fingers trembling slightly. The moment I touched it, the light in the drawer flickered again, brighter this time, as if it were responding to my touch. I slowly flipped the postcard over. On the back, in careful, neat handwriting, was a single phrase. "Don't forget." My breath caught in my chest. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Who had written this? Why was it in my drawer, a place I hadn't opened in years? I stood there, staring at the words, feeling as though the room itself had shifted. The air felt heavier, colder. I could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the faint rustling of the trees outside, but it all seemed distant, muffled, as if the world had moved just slightly out of place. I tried to shake it off. It was just a postcard, a random thing left behind by someone. But something in me told me this wasn't normal. This wasn't just a forgotten piece of paper. This was a message. A warning, perhaps. I placed the postcard back in the drawer, trying to steady my breath. But the glow from the drawer didn't fade. It remained, faint but constant, a strange presence that felt like it was waiting for something. Watching. The room was silent, but my mind was anything but. I couldn't stop thinking about the words on the postcard. Don't forget. What was I not supposed to forget? Why did it feel like it was meant for me, like it was something important, something I had buried deep inside? The air grew colder, and I shivered. The quiet hum of the refrigerator seemed to grow louder, more insistent. I could almost hear my own pulse in my ears. Something was wrong. Something was about to happen. I wanted to leave, to forget everything, to lock the drawer and pretend I hadn't seen any of it. But a deeper part of me knew that I couldn't. The postcard had found me for a reason. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the words were already burned into my mind. Don't forget. Suddenly, the light in the drawer flickered again, and for the briefest moment, I could have sworn I saw something moving inside. Something alive. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. The air felt thick, heavy with an unnatural presence. I couldn't leave it like this. I had to understand. And so, I did the one thing I knew I shouldn't. I reached into the drawer again. The moment my fingers brushed the edge of the drawer, the light grew brighter, almost blinding in its intensity. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath shallow and quick, as if the very act of touching it had triggered something. Something that was watching. Waiting. I could feel the weight of the room pressing in on me, the walls closing in just a little more with each passing second. My fingertips hovered over the postcard, my mind screaming at me to stop, to walk away. But I couldn't. There was something in me, some pull, some instinct, that wouldn't let me leave it alone. With a trembling hand, I picked up the postcard again, the paper feeling unnervingly cold to the touch. The light from the drawer danced on the surface of the card, casting shadows across the writing, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. Don't forget. The words felt like a weight, heavy and suffocating. It was as though they were meant for me, no one else. And I couldn't escape them, not even if I tried. I turned the card over again, desperate to find something more. But there was nothing else. Just the familiar image of the street, bathed in twilight, and those haunting words on the back. I felt a sudden pressure in the air, like a shift in the atmosphere. A tingling sensation crawled up my spine, making my hair stand on end. The light in the drawer flickered again, and something whispered in the shadows of my mind, something faint, almost imperceptible. You shouldn't have looked. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. The voice wasn't real, it couldn't be, but it was there, in the silence, in the air around me. I could feel it creeping into my thoughts, like an echo of something long forgotten. Who? I started, my voice barely a whisper, but the words died in my throat before I could finish. I didn't need to ask. I already knew. Whatever had made the light, whatever had sent the postcard, was not from this world. The drawer seemed to grow colder, more alive. I glanced around the room, but everything was as it had been, quiet, still, the soft glow from the nightlight casting long shadows across the floor. Yet, in that stillness, there was something more. Something that I couldn't see, but could feel pressing in, closing in, suffocating me. I dropped the postcard back into the drawer and slammed it shut. My heart was racing, my breath coming in sharp gasps, but it didn't matter. I couldn't just leave it there. The light from the drawer was still seeping out, and the air around me felt thick with the presence of something I couldn't explain. I backed away, my feet stumbling as I moved towards the door. But the closer I got to the exit, the more I felt it. The pull. Like invisible hands reaching out from behind, urging me to stay. Urging me to look again. I turned, my heart pounding louder than before. The drawer was still there, innocent enough from the outside. The same worn wood, the same chipped surface. But I knew now. It wasn't the drawer that was strange. It was what lay inside. It was what had been waiting there for me all this time. Suddenly, I heard a sound, soft at first, almost like a whispering rustle, but growing louder, clearer. It was coming from the direction of the drawer. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, almost frantic. I had to open it again. I had to know what it was trying to say. But before I could move, I heard something else, something heavier, more distinct. The unmistakable creak of the floorboards, as if someone were standing behind me. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat, but there was no one there. I turned back to the drawer, now almost in a trance. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I had no choice. I had to face it. I walked toward the dresser, my legs unsteady beneath me. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else as I reached for the drawer again. But as my hand gripped the edge, something inside me screamed to stop. Too late. The drawer was already opening. Inside, instead of the postcard, I found something else. A small, old-fashioned key, its brass surface tarnished with age. It was cold to the touch, and as soon as my fingers closed around it, I felt a jolt of electricity shoot through my body. The sensation was sharp, biting, as if the key itself was alive. I staggered back, the key still clenched in my hand. But the whispering continued, louder now, almost frantic. It was like it was coming from all around me, closing in on me from every direction. Don't forget. Don't forget. I could feel the presence again, so close now, so near I could almost reach out and touch it. The air felt thick, heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't comprehend. The key, what did it open? What was I meant to unlock? As the whispers reached a crescendo, my eyes caught something in the corner of the room. A shadow, moving unnaturally, stretching across the wall, almost as if it were a living thing. It was there, waiting for me, watching. And I realized, too late, that I wasn't the one who had been chosen. I was the one who was being watched. The key still lay heavy in my palm, its cold surface like a weight anchoring me to the spot. I couldn't look away from the shadow in the corner of the room. It shifted, fluid and unnatural, stretching and bending like liquid darkness, as if the very fabric of the room had been twisted to allow it to exist. I tried to move, to take a step back, but my body felt like it had been paralyzed, locked in place by some invisible force. The whispering didn't stop. In fact, it grew louder, more insistent, filling my head with its frantic calls. Don't forget. You can't forget. The words crashed against my mind like waves, relentless and overpowering. My chest tightened, each breath harder to draw, as if the air itself were closing in on me. The shadow in the corner flickered, a brief ripple of movement like it was testing the limits of its form. I blinked, and for a second, it was gone. But the key in my hand burned like fire. It was pulling me, urging me to do something I couldn't understand. I glanced at the dresser. The drawer was still open, the faint glow from within it flickering like a distant star. It beckoned me, its light cold and alluring. I didn't know why I moved toward it, why my legs carried me forward despite everything in my mind screaming at me to run, to get out of the room, to leave it all behind. But I couldn't. Something inside me, some primal instinct, forced me forward, closer to the drawer, closer to the thing that had been waiting for me all this time. As I approached, the shadow in the corner shifted again, growing longer and more defined. I could almost make out a shape within it now, something with eyes, something that could see me. And it was coming closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached the drawer, the key shaking in my hand. I glanced over my shoulder, but the shadow was almost upon me. I didn't have much time. With a trembling hand, I held the key above the drawer and stared at the faint crack in the wood, the place where the light had been escaping. The whispers grew louder, now a cacophony of voices, filling my head with demands, with pleas. Don't forget. Open it. Unlock it. I had no choice. With a force I didn't understand, I plunged the key into the crack in the drawer, twisting it as if my body was not my own. There was a moment of resistance, and then a sharp click. The drawer opened with a groan, and the light from within flooded the room. I stumbled back, nearly falling as the drawer fell open completely. But what I saw inside made my blood run cold. It wasn't the drawer that had been glowing. It was the thing inside it. A small, ornate box, its surface etched with strange, twisting patterns that seemed to shift while I wasn't looking directly at them. The box was radiating a soft, golden light, pulsating in time with my heartbeat, like it was alive. My eyes locked onto it, unable to look away. The whispers were gone now, replaced by a deafening silence. But it was a silence that felt heavy, pregnant with something I could not comprehend. I reached for the box, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. My fingers hovered above the surface for a moment, and then I touched it. The moment my skin made contact with the box, a wave of cold swept through me, as if I had plunged into ice-cold water. I gasped, my breath coming out at a sharp, strangled sound. And then, in the silence of the room, I heard it. A voice. not in my ears, but inside my head. You shouldn't have opened it. The words were not a warning, they were a statement of fact. A truth I could not deny. I pulled my hand back, but it was too late. The box trembled, as if it were coming to life, as if it had been waiting for my touch. The glow intensified, brighter now, almost blinding. And then, with a soft click, the top of the box opened. Inside, there was nothing. No trinket, no object. Just a piece of paper. It was crumpled and torn, its edges worn from years of age. Slowly, cautiously, I reached in and unfolded it. The words were hastily written, smeared in places, but the message was clear. You forgot. Now you will remember. The moment I read those words, the room seemed to shift again. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air growing thick and suffocating. The shadow in the corner was no longer a corner, it was all around me. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I could feel something cold and sharp pressing against my chest, like icy fingers wrapping around my heart. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then, in the darkness, I heard it. The faintest rustle of paper, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if someone, or something, was approaching me from behind. But when I turned to look, there was no one there. There was only the key, lying on the floor where I had dropped it, glinting in the light. And the whispers, now clear and distinct, filled my ears once more. You can never forget. I dropped to my knees, gasping for breath, the weight of the room crushing me, the shadow enveloping me completely. There was no escape. The memory was coming back. It was already too late. I don't know how long I knelt there, my hands shaking, my breath ragged. Time seemed to bend in that room, its edges blurring, slipping through my fingers like water. The whispers had stopped for a moment, but the silence was worse. It felt like the calm before a storm, heavy, suffocating, filled with anticipation. I forced myself to stand, my legs unsteady beneath me. The key was still there, glinting on the floor, but the glow from the box had dimmed. The room felt colder now, the air thick with the presence of something dark, something watching. I knew I couldn't stay here much longer. Whatever had been awakened, the thing I had unlocked, it was growing stronger. I backed away from the drawer, my eyes never leaving the box. The writing on the torn piece of paper echoed in my mind. You forgot. Now you will remember. I didn't understand it. I didn't understand any of it. But there was no time to dwell on it now. I had to find a way out. The door to the room was only a few steps away, but as I approached, something in the corner of my vision caught my attention. A shadow, no longer just a fleeting shape, but something more defined, more solid. It was standing in the doorway. It wasn't a person, or at least not in the way I understood. It was tall, unnaturally so. Its limbs stretched too far, its outline jagged and warped, as if the very fabric of reality had been bent to allow it to take shape. The figure stood there, unmoving, its presence somehow more threatening than anything I had felt before. I froze. My feet rooted to the floor as the shadows seemed to ripple, its form undulating like smoke, swirling in and out of existence. It was as though it had always been there, lurking just beyond my sight, waiting for me to open the box. Waiting for me to remember. The whispers returned, louder now, urgent, calling to me from all directions. You can't leave. You shouldn't have forgotten. I turned to face the figure, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. It was so close now, but its movements were slow, deliberate, like it was savoring my fear. I reached for the doorknob, my fingers trembling. I knew I had to escape, but with every inch closer I got, the air thickened, the pressure mounting until it felt like the walls were closing in on me. The shadow took a step forward. The floor creaked under its weight, and I stumbled back in terror. I couldn't move fast enough. The room was closing in on me, the space shrinking, the figure looming larger with every passing second. You shouldn't have forgotten. The words echoed in my mind, the truth of them piercing through the fog of my fear. I knew, deep down, that I couldn't outrun it. Whatever was in that box, whatever had been unleashed, it was not something I could escape. I could feel its presence growing stronger, the weight of it pressing against me, suffocating me. But then, something shifted. The figure paused, its movements faltering. It seemed to waver, like it was struggling to maintain its form. I felt a strange pull inside me, an urge to fight back, to stand my ground. Maybe there was a way to stop it, to end this nightmare before it consumed me entirely. I remembered the key. The one thing that had caused all of this. It had been the key that had unlocked the drawer. The key that had awakened the shadow. Without thinking, I grabbed it from the floor, my hand closing around the cold metal. The moment I touched it, the shadow seemed to recoil, its form rippling like water disturbed by a stone. It hissed, a sound like nails scraping against metal, before it surged forward again, faster this time. In a panic, I shoved the key into the box. I didn't know why, but something told me it was the only way to fight back. The moment the key made contact with the box, the room seemed to explode in light. Bright, blinding light. For a moment, I couldn't see anything at all. My body was weightless, suspended in a glow, as if I was being pulled through some kind of portal. The air was electric, charged with an energy I couldn't comprehend. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light vanished. I blinked, disoriented, trying to make sense of what had happened. The room was quiet. The shadow was gone. The pressure in the air had lifted. I could breathe again. But I wasn't alone. The box lay open on the floor, its golden glow dimmed, but now there was something else inside. A photograph. My photograph. I bent down, my hand shaking as I picked it up. It was an old picture, worn at the edges, faded with time. It showed me, younger, standing in front of a house I didn't recognize. But there was something wrong with it. The house looked off. It was too dark, too still, as though it was not part of this world at all. I turned the photograph over, my pulse quickening. On the back, in faded ink, were the same words I had seen before. You forgot. Now you will remember. Suddenly, everything came rushing back. The house. The box. The key. The memory of what had happened years ago, what I had buried, what I had tried to forget, came crashing back with full force. I remembered the night when everything had changed, when I had unlocked something I should never have. And now, whatever was in that box was coming back to collect what it was owed. I wasn't free. I had never been. The shadow had never really gone. And now, it was time for me to face the consequences. The air felt heavy again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just the oppressive weight of fear, it was something worse. A knowing. An understanding that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The photograph still gripped tightly in my hand, its image of the house, now familiar yet foreign, seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. I stared at it, feeling a wave of dizziness wash over me, as if reality itself were bending, warping around the edges. I had seen that house before, and I had lived in it. But why had I forgotten? And more importantly, what had I done to make me forget? The whispers were gone, but the silence felt worse. The shadow wasn't here anymore, but I could feel its presence lingering in the corners of my mind. It was waiting, watching. I turned my back to the photograph, dropping it onto the floor, as if by doing so I could sever the tie between the past and present. But it didn't work. The room remained unchanged, the walls the same dull, chipped paint, the dresser where I had found the drawer still there. Nothing had shifted outwardly. It was only within me that things were different now. The room wasn't a safe place anymore. It was a trap, an extension of something much larger, something that had been waiting for me to remember. The memory had found its way back, just as the box had promised. I stumbled towards the door, my body moving mechanically, too numb to feel the ground beneath my feet. My eyes locked onto the handle, but the moment I reached for it, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Someone was standing in the doorway. I froze. It wasn't the shadow this time. A figure stood there, the outline faint but growing clearer, a dark silhouette framed by the dim hallway light. The figure was tall, its proportions wrong, as if it had been stretched too far. Its edges flickered, like it was half real, but the presence of it was unmistakable. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. The air felt suffocating, as though the very space around me was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The figure took a step forward, its movements slow, deliberate. With each step, the air around it seemed to warp, bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It was like the world itself was unraveling at the edges, and the figure, whatever it was at the center of it all. A voice, soft, like the rustle of dry leaves, came from the figure. "You've remembered too much." The words didn't feel like they belonged to the figure. They felt like they were coming from all around me, inside me. I could feel them crawling beneath my skin, digging deep into my mind. I backed away, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The walls seemed to close in on me again, the space shrinking. There was no way out. The figure took another step forward, its form flickering, as if it were unsure whether it could remain solid in this world. But it didn't matter. It wasn't the form that mattered, it was what it carried with it. The air grew colder. I could feel the presence pressing in on me, suffocating me, draining the warmth from my body. I was being consumed, slowly, piece by piece. It's time to remember everything. The figure's voice was louder now, more forceful, the sound not just in my ears, but reverberating deep within my bones. The world around me seemed to tilt, to twist, as memories long buried rushed back in torrents. I could see the house now, more clearly than ever before. The walls. The rooms. The feeling of dread that had never left. And the box. The same box that had been sitting on the dresser in front of me. The one that had led me here. I remembered unlocking it all those years ago. I remembered the feeling of the cold key turning in the lock. I remembered the darkness that had poured out of it. And I remembered the price. "You thought you could forget," the figure whispered, its voice growing darker, more insistent. "But the memory has a price. And you will pay it now." The room around me began to twist, the floor warping beneath me, the walls stretching outward like rubber. The figure moved closer still, its form shimmering in and out of focus. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest, but I could feel the walls pressing on me. There was nowhere to go. The door was still there, but it wasn't a way out. It was a part of the trap. The figure reached out with an elongated hand, its fingers long and thin, stretching unnaturally. I couldn't look away as it touched my face, the coldness of its touch seeping into my skin. Now you remember. And with that, everything went dark. I don't know how long I was unconscious. It could have been minutes or hours. It felt like an eternity. When I opened my eyes again, I was no longer in the room. I was standing in the hallway of the house. But it wasn't just the hallway from my memories, it was the one from my nightmares. The walls were darker now, covered in shadows that seemed to move on their own, twisting and flickering like flames. The air was thick with a stench of decay, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the faintest sound, a soft scratching, like something moving beneath the floorboards. I turned around, and the door was gone. I was trapped. And now, with the full force of the memories flooding back, I understood. I had always been here. The house. The box. The shadow. It had never been a mistake. It had always been waiting for me to return. And I would never escape. Have you ever caught a glimpse of something strange in the mirror? Something that shouldn't be there, something that doesn't belong? At first, you might dismiss it as a trick of the light or a figment of your imagination. But what if it wasn't? It all started one cold evening as I walked down the dimly lit street. The shops were closing, and the sidewalks were empty except for a few stray leaves blowing in the wind. The city was quiet, almost too quiet, as if it was holding its breath for something to happen. I was on my way home after a long day, my coat pulled tightly around me to ward out the chill. As I passed a small shop with an old-fashioned display window, I noticed something unusual. A mirror hung in the corner of the window, reflecting the street outside. The reflection was exactly as it should have been, dim street lights, empty sidewalks, and my own tired face staring back at me. But then, in the corner of the mirror, I saw him. A man. A passerby. He was standing just out of my direct line of sight, as if he had appeared out of nowhere. His figure was hazy at first, like a blur, but then it became clearer. He was tall, with dark hair and a long coat that seemed too old-fashioned for this time. His face was pale, and his eyes, well, I couldn't see his eyes. They were just black shadows, like empty voids. I blinked. The man wasn't there on the street. I looked quickly around, no one. The street was still empty. My heart started to race. My breath came in short bursts. The man was only in the mirror. He wasn't outside. I turned to walk away, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. But my eyes couldn't leave the glass. I glanced back at the reflection, and there he was again, still standing in the corner, watching. He hadn't moved. For a moment, I thought I must be imagining it. The exhaustion of the day, the dim lighting, maybe it was all playing tricks on me. But no! I knew what I had seen. I walked faster, trying to distance myself from the shop, but the image of that strange man stayed with me. His presence, or rather, the absence of it, was like a weight pressing against my mind. Something about him felt wrong, like he didn't belong in this world. When I got home, I tried to shake it off. But as I lay in bed that night, my thoughts kept drifting back to the man in the mirror. What was he? Why was he there? And why hadn't I seen him outside, on the street? The questions swirled in my mind, mixing with the darkness of the night. I tried to sleep, but the uneasy feeling lingered, like a shadow I couldn't escape. I must have finally drifted off, but when I woke, the man was there again. Not in the mirror this time. No. This time, he was in my dreams. The dream was always the same. I was standing in a place I couldn't recognize, an old, forgotten city, its streets empty, its buildings leaning on each other like they were about to collapse. The air was thick with fog, and I could hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing, though I couldn't see anyone around. And then, there he was. The man. He appeared from behind one of the crumbling buildings, stepping into the fog with a slow, deliberate pace. His dark coat swayed with emotion, but his face was always hidden, the shadows where his eyes should have been like deep pits. I couldn't see his expression, but I could feel him watching me. I tried to move, but my legs felt heavy, as though I was stuck in place. I couldn't look away from him, and it was like he knew. Like he was waiting for me to make the first move. The dream would always end the same way. He would stop just a few feet from me, the silence stretching between us. I would feel an overwhelming sense of dread, and then, just before he reached out to me, I would wake up, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. The first time I had the dream, I brushed it off. It was just a nightmare, I told myself. But when it happened again the next night, and the night after that, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was happening. Something beyond the dream. The man, the reflection, the city from my dreams, none of it made sense. But I knew that it wasn't just my imagination playing tricks on me anymore. Something was connecting the two worlds, the real world and the world inside my dreams. And the man in the mirror was the key. I had to understand who he was. I had to figure out what he wanted. And most of all, I had to figure out why he kept appearing in my dreams. But every time I tried to investigate, to look for answers, I was met with silence. No one had seen the man in the mirror. No one could tell me anything about the strange city from my dreams. It was as if the world was conspiring to keep me in the dark. Then, one night, I saw him again, not in my dreams this time, but outside my window. And this time, he wasn't alone. It was the dead of night when I saw him again. I had been sitting in my living room, trying to shake off the lingering anxiety of the past few days. The man in the mirror, the strange city in my dreams, everything was becoming a blur of unease and confusion. I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every time I closed my eyes, there he was, standing in that cold, forgotten place. I couldn't escape him, not even in the waking world. The clock ticked quietly on the wall, each second dragging by as I stared at the empty room. The lights from the street outside filtered weakly through the curtains, casting long shadows across the floor. That's why I saw it. A shadow, flickering outside the window. A figure, standing motionless just beyond the glass, barely visible in the dim light. My heart skipped a beat. I froze. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it. I had become so consumed with the idea of the man that my mind was playing tricks on me. But no! The shadow was real. It was solid, distinct. It was standing there, in my backyard, just out of view. I stood up slowly, my breath catching in my throat. My feet moved of their own accord, as if pulled by some unseen force. I moved towards the window, my pulse quickening with every step. I had to know who it was. I had to see. I pulled the curtains aside, my heart pounding in my chest. And there he was. The man. Standing in my backyard. But this time, he wasn't just a reflection in the mirror. He wasn't just a figure in my dreams. He was real. His face, still shrouded in darkness, was tilted upward, staring directly at the window. I could feel his eyes, or at least the absence of them, burning through me. He was waiting, watching. I could see now that his features were distorted, as if his face was not entirely human. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, and his long, dark coat billowed in the wind, though there was no breeze. He stood perfectly still, but I could feel the air around him pulse with a strange, unnatural energy. My breath caught in my throat as I backed away from the window, my legs shaking. What did he want from me? Why was he here? I stumbled backwards, my mind racing. Should I call someone? The police? No, who would believe me? Who could help me when the person I was seeing wasn't even real? I tried to convince myself it was a dream or some kind of hallucination. But deep down, I knew the truth. It was real. He was real. I couldn't look away. My eyes were glued to him, even though every instinct in my body told me to run, to get as far away from him as possible. But it was too late. He raised a hand. At first, it was slow, almost hesitant, as if he was testing something. But then, with a sudden motion, his arm shot out, his long fingers pressing against the glass. I recoiled in shock, my heart skipping a beat. The glass, my window, vibrated under the force of his touch. A low, scraping sound echoed through the room, like nails dragging across metal. The world around me seemed to distort, the air growing thick and heavy. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him, even though every part of me screamed to run. Then, in the quietest of whispers, I heard it. The same voice from my dreams. You are mine. The words chilled me to the bone. They were not spoken, but felt, a cold, creeping sensation that dug into my skin and crawled under my bones. I could feel his presence in my chest, constricting around my heart. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. What did he mean? What did he want from me? Why had he been haunting me like this, crossing the boundary between dreams and reality? And then it hit me, the reflection. The man in the mirror. The man who had appeared in the window that first day. I had seen him before. I had always seen him, but I had never understood. Now, I realized the terrible truth. He wasn't just a reflection. He was a part of me. A part of something dark, something that had been following me, waiting for the right moment to claim me. The mirror wasn't just a window into the past. It was a doorway. And the man was the key. I needed to stop him. I had to find a way to break the connection, to escape his reach. But when I turned back to the window, the man was gone. I rushed to the glass, my hands shaking as I pulled the curtains back. The yard was empty. The night was still. I didn't know if I should feel relieved or more terrified. The man was gone, but I knew he would be back. He wasn't finished with me yet. And I couldn't help but feel that the worst was still to come. The following days were a blur of unease and confusion. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting just beyond the edge of my vision. It wasn't just the man anymore, it was the presence itself. I could feel it lurking in the corners of my mind, twisting every thought I had, pulling me deeper into something I didn't understand. I couldn't tell anyone what had been happening. Who would believe me? How could I explain what I had seen without sounding insane? So, I kept it all inside, trying to ignore the growing dread that consumed me. But it wasn't enough. The man wasn't going away. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw him, his shadowy face, his hollow eyes, standing just behind me. His presence had started to bleed into my waking life, and I couldn't escape it. It was as though he was everywhere. The reflection in the glass, the shadow in the corner of the room, the figure that flickered at the edge of my vision when I was alone. It was becoming impossible to tell where the real world ended and the dream world began. Then, one evening, something happened that forced me to confront the truth. I had been sitting in my living room again, trying to focus on something, anything, to distract myself from the ever-present sense of dread. The clock on the wall ticked away the seconds, each one louder than the last, a constant reminder of how much time was slipping away. I stood up to grab a drink from the kitchen, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for the glass. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive, like it was closing in on me. That's when I noticed it, the mirror. It was just a small mirror, one of those cheap, framed ones you'd find in any thrift store. But it had been sitting in the corner of the room, next to the bookshelf, for as long as I could remember. I had never paid much attention to it before, but now, something about it seemed off. I walked toward it, drawn by an unseen force. As I stood in front of the glass, I noticed something new. A crack. A small, jagged line had appeared in the mirror, running diagonally across the surface. It was as if something had scraped against it, something sharp, something that had been waiting to break through. I reached out to touch it, my fingers brushing against the cool glass. And that's when I saw it, the reflection. But this time, it wasn't just the room behind me. It wasn't just my own face staring back. In the mirror, there was something else. Something I hadn't seen before. The man. But he wasn't standing behind me, as he always had. No, this time, he was inside the mirror. I watched, horrified, as his figure seemed to materialize from the glass itself, his dark coat flowing out of the crack like ink spilling from a bottle. His face was still hidden in shadow, but I could feel his gaze, cold and unyielding, focused on me. He was no longer just a reflection. He was moving, becoming real. My heart raced. My breath caught in my throat. I took a step back, but the man in the mirror didn't move. His eyes, if you could even call them eyes, followed my every movement. There was a strange, unnatural stillness to him, like he was waiting for me to do something. Like he was waiting for me to make a mistake. The crack in the glass widened, and for a brief moment, I thought I could see something behind it, something beyond the mirror, something dark and endless, like a vast chasm waiting to swallow me whole. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the reflection of the man was gone. The crack in the glass closed up, leaving only the smooth, undisturbed surface behind. I stood there, frozen, unable to move, unable to comprehend what had just happened. My mind was reeling. Was I losing my mind? Was this all just some twisted figment of my imagination? But deep down, I knew the truth. The mirror wasn't just a reflection. It was a doorway. A portal. I wasn't sure how or why, but the man had crossed from one world to the other. And now, he was here, with me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The dreams. The reflections. The crack in the mirror. It was all part of something bigger, something I couldn't escape. The man was not just a symbol. He was a presence, a force, and he wasn't finished with me yet. I needed answers. But the more I searched, the more questions I had. Who was he? Why was he haunting me? And most terrifying of all, what did he want? There was only one place left to turn. the mirror itself. I knew I had to confront him if I was going to survive. But I also knew that whatever awaited me on the other side of that glass would change everything. And as I stared into the mirror, I could feel his presence just beyond the surface, waiting for me to step forward. The air in the room felt colder, as if the very atmosphere was thickening around me. The mirror, once just a simple reflection of my room, now loomed before me like an open door, an invitation to something far darker than I was ready to face. I stood there, trembling, my breath visible in the frigid air. The crack, once a jagged line of damage, had disappeared, but the feeling of something being behind the glass remained. Something watching, waiting. I didn't know how long I had been standing there, frozen in place, my body refusing to move. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to turn away, to forget this madness. But I couldn't. Something in me knew I had to go forward. I had to face the man. I took a tentative step forward, my feet heavy on the floor, as though the ground itself was reluctant to let me move. The closer I got to the mirror, the more intense the feeling of his presence became. It was as if he was drawing me in, pulling me toward him. And then, just as I was within arm's reach of the glass, I saw it. His face. Not a shadow, not an outline, but his face, clear, almost too clear. It was distorted, but in a way that made it all the more real. The skin was pale, stretched tight over the bones, and his eyes, those hollow, dark eyes, stared directly at me. I was no longer looking at a reflection. I was looking through it. Into him. He was in the mirror. And now, I could feel his gaze pierce into my very soul. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, the cold air now a weight pressing against my chest. The man, he was not just in the glass. He was inside it. Inside the world beyond. And then the whisper came, low and chilling. You have come. I tried to speak, to shout, to break the connection. But no words came. It was as if the air itself had turned to ice, freezing me in place. His figure shifted, a slight movement, a flicker of motion, but too quick for my eyes to follow. And then, with a sudden, terrifying clarity, I understood. The man was not just watching me. He was calling me. He wasn't just haunting my dreams, my reflections, he was pulling me into the mirror. He was inviting me to cross over, to join him in whatever dark, twisted place he had come from. I stepped back instinctively, my hand reaching out to touch the mirror, to push it away. But the moment my fingers brushed against the surface, the glass rippled like water. A wave of dread washed over me. My reflection. I wasn't in it anymore. The mirror now showed only the man. His smile, if it could be called a smile, twisted as he stepped closer, his hand stretching toward me from the other side of the glass. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed. My mind screamed for escape, but my body refused to obey. I couldn't move. I couldn't break free from the pull of his gaze. Then, with a sudden violent force, the mirror seemed to expand, sucking me in. The world around me blurred, the room fading into a swirl of darkness, and before I could react, I was falling, pulled by an invisible force. I hit the cold ground with a thud. It wasn't the floor of my living room. The walls, the ceiling, they were gone. All around me was a vast, empty void. The air smelled stale, and the silence was deafening. And there, standing just beyond me, was the man. He hadn't moved. He was just there, watching. I tried to stand, but my body felt heavy, like I was underwater. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the coldness, the emptiness of this place pressing in on me from all sides. The man took a step toward me, his movements unnaturally smooth, as though he glided rather than walked. And then, just as he reached out to touch me, everything snapped back. I was back in my living room. The mirror was in front of me, as if nothing had happened. The crack was gone. The man was no longer there. I looked around, my breath ragged, my mind reeling. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination? No, I knew it had been real. The cold, the emptiness, the man, I couldn't explain it, but it was undeniable. I stumbled back, disoriented, my mind grasping for anything to make sense of it. But one thing was certain, I couldn't stay here. I couldn't live like this anymore. The mirror wasn't just a reflection of reality. It was a gateway. A place where someone, was waiting to pull me in. I grabbed my coat, my hands trembling, and headed for the door. But just as I reached for the handle, I heard it. The faintest sound. A whisper. "You can't run." I turned, my heart stopping in my chest. The mirror, it wasn't empty anymore. There, on the other side, in the glass, I saw his face. His hollow eyes. His twisted smile. And I knew then, he wasn't done with me. Have you ever felt like someone, or something, was following you, even though you were sure you were alone? That uneasy sensation that creeps over you, the hairs on your neck standing up, even when there's no one there to cause it? I remember the exact moment I first felt it. It was late, far too late for a commute. The trains were sparse, their rhythmic screeches echoing through the empty subway tunnel. The platform was nearly deserted, save for a few people scattered around, most lost in their thoughts or staring blankly at their phones. The only light came from the flickering fluorescent lamps that buzzed faintly overhead, casting strange shadows on the cold, tiled walls. I had just finished a long day at work, and my body was sore, aching for the comfort of my bed. The last thing I wanted was to be stuck at a nearly empty train station. But there I was, waiting for the next train to take me home. It wasn't the stillness of the platform that bothered me at first, it was something else. A presence, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. At first, I thought it was just the fatigue playing tricks on my mind. But then I saw it, a shadow darting across the tunnel. I stopped breathing. The train wasn't anywhere near, yet the shadow moved along the tunnel with incredible speed. It wasn't a passing vehicle's reflection, and it wasn't the movement of another person. It was far too large and far too fast. My eyes strained to focus, but it was like the shadow was alive, twisting and changing as it followed the track. I blinked, thinking I was seeing things, but when I opened my eyes again, it was still there. It lingered just out of my line of sight, but I could feel its presence, watching, waiting. I stepped back, the weight of it pressing down on me. The train was due to arrive soon, and the hum of the tracks vibrated beneath my feet. I turned to look at the others on the platform, but they hadn't noticed anything. Everyone was absorbed in their own world. The quiet noise of their conversations and the sound of scrolling on phones created a disorienting contrast with the strange, oppressive feeling in the air. I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was nothing. But my heart raced, and I couldn't help but glance nervously at the darkness of the tunnel. The shadow was gone, at least it appeared to be. But the feeling, it didn't go away. The train came, its headlights slicing through the dim light of the platform. I stepped inside, eager to be surrounded by the noise and bustle of passengers. But as the train began to move, I couldn't shake the thought of that shadow, of something following me, just out of reach, hidden in the darkness. My breath caught in my throat as I glanced around the train car, looking for any sign that I wasn't alone. It wasn't until the doors slid shut that I thought I saw something, or rather, someone, reflected in the window. A figure standing at the far end of the tunnel, just beyond the edge of the platform. A figure that shouldn't have been there. I turned quickly, my mind racing, but there was no one in the car with me. I was alone. Yet, somehow, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That something, or someone, was still following, even if I couldn't see it. The train hurtled down the tracks, its screeching sound echoing through the tunnels as I stared at the reflection in the window, willing it to show me something, anything, that would make sense of the madness in my mind. But there was nothing. Just the dimly lit subway, the occasional flicker of lights, and the sound of the train's wheels on the rails. I closed my eyes, hoping to allay the unease that had settled deep in my chest. But the thought wouldn't leave me. The shadow. The presence. It was still out there, somewhere, waiting. And as the train pulled into my station, I braced myself for what came next. I had to get off. I had to leave the train, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, wasn't just a trick of my tired mind. I stepped off the train and onto the platform, the cool air hitting me like a slap in the face. The station was even quieter now. No one was around. Just me and the dim glow of the overhead lights. The echo of my footsteps reverberated in the empty space. I turned to walk toward the exit, but then something caught my movement. A shadow, just out of place, stretching across the walls, moving against the flickering light. I froze, heart pounding. It wasn't my reflection. The shadow was too solid, too distinct. It moved along the edge of the platform, as though following me. And then, just as I turned to run, the shadow twisted, and I saw it, a figure, standing still, against the far wall, eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. And that's when I realized the shadow hadn't been in the tunnel at all. It had been following me. I ran. My feet pounded against the cold tiles, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls like a drumbeat in the stillness of the station. The figure in the shadow didn't move. It stood there, its eyes glowing faintly, watching me. I could feel the weight of its gaze pressing into my back as I sprinted toward the exit. My mind raced, each thought sharper than the last. This isn't real. I'm imagining things. It's just the exhaustion. But even as I tried to convince myself, the unease was suffocating, like a presence breathing down my neck. I glanced back once, just to see if I was being followed. The figure was gone. The platform was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as if the shadows themselves were alive, following me, waiting for me to make a mistake. My breath came in short gasps as I reached the stairs, and with a final burst of energy, I pushed through the turnstile and out into the night. The city streets were empty, as expected at this hour. The dim glow of streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, but there was no sign of the figure, no trace of the unnatural presence that had followed me in the subway. I stood there for a moment, the cool night air filling my lungs as I tried to calm my racing heart. I needed to get home. I needed to escape this overwhelming sense of dread that had settled over me. But as I walked down the street, my mind kept drifting back to that moment in the station, to the figure in the shadow. It didn't make sense. I had seen it with my own eyes. The way it stood there, motionless, The way its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, it wasn't something that could be explained away by exhaustion or stress. I tried to push the thought aside, but it lingered like a dark cloud hanging over me. The worst part was the feeling that it wasn't over. That somehow it had followed me. That it was waiting for me to return to the place where I had seen it, where it had first appeared. The station. The shadows. It was all connected. By the time I reached my apartment building, I was trembling. My hands shook as I fumbled for my keys, and the sound of the metal scraping against the lock was like a scream in the silence of the night. I hurried inside, closing the door behind me with a soft click, as though that simple action would somehow protect me from whatever was following. I threw my bag on the couch and collapsed onto the chair, my heart still pounding in my chest. My eyes darted around the room, every corner seeming to hide something I couldn't see. The apartment felt too quiet, too still. The darkness pressed in from every angle, and I couldn't shake the sensation that something was lurking, waiting to pounce. I glanced at the clock, past midnight. The city outside seemed so far away, as though I were alone in my own little world, cut off from everything else. I walked into the kitchen, my movements mechanical, as if on autopilot. I needed something to calm my nerves, something to take my mind off the events of the night. A glass of water. A cup of tea. Anything to fill the silence. That's when I heard it. A sound. Quiet at first, but unmistakable. The soft scrape of metal against glass. I turned, my heart leaping into my throat. The sound had come from the hallway, from the bathroom. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the door as the noise continued, slow and deliberate. What could it be? My mind raced, but the only thing that felt certain was the sense of dread that was now gripping me. I took a hesitant step forward, my legs barely supporting me. Each step felt heavier than the last, like something was pulling me closer to the door. The sound stopped. I reached for the doorknob and turned it slowly, feeling the cold metal against my skin. The bathroom light flickered as I pushed the door open, half expecting to find nothing at all. But as I stepped inside, I froze. The mirror. I had never noticed it before, or perhaps I had never paid enough attention. But tonight, in the dim light, the reflection wasn't quite right. The edges were blurry, shifting, as though something was distorting it. But what really caught my attention was the shadow. The same shadow from the subway. It was there, in the mirror, moving along the edge of the glass. The figure stood tall, its form indistinct, a blur in the reflection. Its eyes, those haunting eyes, were visible, glowing faintly in the darkness. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. How could it be here? It had been in the subway, in the station. There was no way it could be in my apartment, no way. But as I looked back at the mirror, I saw it. The figure in the reflection wasn't standing still anymore. It was moving, its shape shifting, drawing closer. I didn't know if it was the reflection of the shadow itself or something far worse, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure stepped closer and closer until it reached the edge of the mirror, its hand outstretched, as though it were trying to break through the glass. And then it spoke. A voice, low and guttural, like a whisper from the deepest corners of the earth. You see me now. I bolted from the room, slamming the bathroom door behind me. My mind screamed for me to wake up, to run, to escape whatever was happening. But no matter where I went in the apartment, that voice echoed in my head, the figure in the mirror haunting me with its words. I had to get out. I had to leave before it found a way to come through the glass. But as I reached for my phone, my hand trembled so much that I could barely dial a number. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in on me, as though the very apartment itself had become a trap. And I realized there was nowhere to run. The shadow was here, and it was waiting for me. I didn't know how long I stood there, my back pressed against the bathroom door, but the echo of the shadow's voice seemed to grow louder in my mind. "You see me now." It was like a cold whisper that wrapped itself around my thoughts, refusing to let go. I could still feel the presence of the figure, as if it was looming just beyond the walls of my apartment, waiting. My hand shook violently as I pulled my phone from my pocket. My fingers fumbled across the screen, dialing the number for the police, but my mind was too foggy, too clouded with fear. What was I going to tell them? I couldn't explain this. How could I? The figure in the mirror wasn't real. It couldn't be. And yet, there it was, unmistakable, an unshakable presence that had followed me from the subway. My thumb hovered over the call button, but just as I was about to press it, I heard it again. The scrape of metal against glass. It came from the bathroom. I turned, my pulse racing. This time, I knew. It wasn't just in my head. It was real. The figure had followed me. I wasn't sure how to move, how to escape. I had been running, trying to outrun the terror that had consumed me, but there was no safe place. The apartment felt like a prison. I wasn't alone here anymore. The figure was watching, waiting. Its eyes, glowing faintly, were now in my mind, in the very air I breathed. I ran into the living room, desperate to get away from the door, away from the mirror. I threw the curtains open and peered outside. The street was empty, bathed in the same dull light as when I had come in earlier. Nothing had changed. But I knew it wasn't just in the apartment. The figure had crossed the threshold. It's everywhere now. I turned back, my breath quick and shallow, and my eyes darted across the room. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, the shadows stretching farther than they should. It wasn't just the bathroom. It wasn't just the mirror. The figure was in the room with me now. I could feel it. And I could feel it moving closer. I heard the creak of the floorboards, slow and deliberate, as if something heavy was shifting in the shadows, something moving without sound but always just on the edge of perception. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight and the words stuck. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. And then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the shadow. It was no longer confined to the bathroom mirror, no longer hidden in a reflection. It was there, in the corner of the room, its shape twisting, flickering in the low light. It was closer than before, its long fingers stretching out from the darkness, its eyes like pools of ink. And I realized with a sickening certainty that it wasn't just a shadow. It was coming for me. In a blind panic, I stumbled toward the front door, my heart hammering in my chest. But just as I reached for the handle, a cold rush of air swept through the room, the door slamming shut with a force that made the walls rattle. I turned, my breath caught in my throat, and looked toward the mirror again. There it was, standing still in the reflection. But this time, its eyes weren't just glowing, they were fixed on me, staring into me, through me. Its face was pale, empty, like a mask of someone who had forgotten what it was to be human. And it was smiling. That twisted smile stretched across its face, like the grin of something that knew it had already won. The fear that had gripped me earlier was now a raw, gnawing panic. I felt as though I couldn't breathe, like the very air around me was thickening, closing in, suffocating me. And that's when I realized it wasn't just the shadow that was after me. It was the reflection. I wasn't just seeing it in the mirror. It was me in there. It was me standing in the mirror, smiling back at myself. But that smile wasn't mine. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. My eyes were locked on the figure in the mirror, the distorted version of myself. The real me, the terrified me, was shaking, frozen in place. But the reflection wasn't shaking. The reflection wasn't scared. It was reaching out to me, its fingers pressed against the glass, its smile widening. Then the reflection spoke again, its voice low, like gravel grinding against stone. You can't run. You can't hide. I am always here. Suddenly, the reflection reached out farther, its hand pushing through the glass as if it were breaking through some invisible barrier. I stumbled backward, tripping over the couch and crashing to the floor. I was trapped. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I crawled across the floor, backing away from the mirror, but the shadow, it was moving. It was everywhere now, slipping out of the reflection and into the room. Its fingers brushed against the edges of the glass, and I realized with horror that it was pulling the mirror apart. The last thing I remember before the darkness swallowed me was the sound of shattering glass, the mirror breaking, and something cold wrapping around me, pulling me down into the depths of the shadow. And then there was nothing. Just the endless, silent darkness. I woke to silence. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, suffocating and heavy. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. The confusion was thick, clouding my thoughts like fog. I tried to move, but my limbs felt numb, disconnected, as though they belonged to someone else. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, each one feeling more labored than the last. I opened my eyes, but all I could see was darkness. At first, I thought it was the aftermath of the shadow, the void that had consumed me. Maybe I hadn't escaped after all. But then, as I lay there, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, I realized something worse. It wasn't just dark, it was cold, and the air felt wrong, stale. I couldn't feel the floor beneath me, no warmth of the apartment around me, no familiar sounds of the outside world. It was as though I had been swallowed whole, as though the world I knew had ceased to exist. Panic began to creep in, clawing at my chest, tightening my throat. Where am I? The question echoed in my mind, louder than anything else, but there was no answer. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I tried to sit up, to push against the emptiness, but my body wouldn't cooperate. The more I struggled, the more I realized I wasn't alone. Something was here with me. The air grew heavier, colder. It was as if the very space around me was pressing in, trying to crush me from all sides. The stillness was unnerving, the absence of sound like a scream trapped in the void. And then, out of that oppressive silence, a sound, barely perceptible at first, began to echo through the darkness. A soft scraping. It was slow, deliberate, like fingers dragging along the surface of something rough. I froze. It was too familiar. The sound of metal against glass, the same sound I had heard in the apartment, the same sound that had followed me from the mirror. It was here. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, close, so close. The air felt charged, like a storm about to break. The scraping continued. Closer, louder. I turned my head, desperate to find the source, but there was nothing. Only the blackness, stretching endlessly in all directions. Then, a whisper. low, guttural, like a breath escaping from the depths of a cave. You can't escape. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My mouth was dry, my throat tight, like something was choking the life out of me. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, thumping louder than anything else, but it didn't drown out the voice. It was inside my head. You will never escape. The scraping stopped. And then there was movement. Something shifted in the darkness, a subtle change in the air. I could feel it, the presence moving closer. I couldn't see it, but I could sense it. It was like the very fabric of the space around me was shifting, bending. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but the darkness pressed harder, suffocating. I tried to breathe, but the air felt thick, dense, as though it was trying to smother me. And then I felt it. Cold. Icy cold, like fingers brushing against my skin, sending a wave of terror down my spine. The touch was light at first, like a whisper on the air, but it was unmistakable. It was the shadow. I opened my eyes and saw nothing but the same endless blackness. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I couldn't tell where I was anymore. My mind screamed for me to wake up, to escape, but I was trapped. I couldn't escape. It was everywhere now. The shadow was pulling me into itself, wrapping around me like a cloak of suffocating darkness. I felt myself being dragged downward, deeper into the void, into the cold. My body was no longer my own. It was as if something else had taken control. It was pulling me apart, piece by piece, erasing me from existence. But even as I was consumed, I realized something. The shadow wasn't just after me. It was after everyone. It had found me, yes, but now it was moving beyond. It was reaching out, seeking others, searching for new souls to claim. The dark had opened its mouth, and it would devour everything. And then I heard it again, clear this time, right in front of me. You see me now. And with that, the darkness swallowed me whole. When I woke again, I was standing. The cold was gone. The air felt normal again, warm even, but the change was unsettling. I was no longer in the suffocating void. I wasn't in the apartment. I wasn't anywhere I recognized. The city street stretched out before me, dimly lit by streetlights, just like that night I had first left the station. But everything was off. The buildings were wrong, the shapes distorted, like a reflection in a cracked mirror. The ground beneath me felt strange, like it was shifting, moving. I looked around, but there was no one else on the street. The silence was just as oppressive as before, the kind of silence that feels wrong. I turned to the window of a nearby building, looking for some sign of normalcy, and caught my own reflection. But it wasn't me. The figure stared back at me. Its smile was wide, cold, and empty. The same eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness. I reached out to touch the glass, and the reflection mirrored me, its hand extending to meet mine. And then, the figure stepped forward. Through the glass. The last thing I felt was its cold touch as it gripped my arm, pulling me into the reflection. And everything went black. The shadow had found its new home. And I was its prisoner, lost in the mirror, forever trapped in the reflection. Have you ever heard something in the quiet of the night, something that couldn't possibly be real, yet it felt so tangible you had no choice but to believe? What if, in the darkness, the past reached out to you in a way you could neither understand nor escape? It was late when I first heard it. A soft, breathy whisper, like a voice just beyond the reach of my hearing. I sat up in bed, listening intently. It was coming from the other side of my apartment door. I wasn't alone, of course. The apartment was mine alone, but the silence had always been a presence. A constant companion. I had lived in this old building for years now, and every creak of the floorboards, every subtle groan of the walls, I had come to know. But this was different. It wasn't the wind or the building settling. No, this was something deliberate. Someone. At first, I told myself it was nothing. A trick of the mind. It had to be. The kind of noise that plays with you after a long day, when the exhaustion makes you imagine things. So, I turned over and closed my eyes, trying to let sleep take me. But it didn't. The whisper grew louder. Almost clear. It sounded like my name. Eliza. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. My breath caught. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I just listened. The whisper was soft, a faint murmur, but it was real. I could hear it right there. It was too clear to ignore. Too close. I tried to shake the fear that crept up my spine. I told myself again that it was my mind playing tricks on me. But something deep inside me knew better. I wasn't alone in that apartment. Slowly, I swung my legs off the bed, my feet meeting the cool hardwood floor with a quiet thud. Every part of me was telling me to stay, to lock myself in and pretend it was just a bad dream. But I couldn't. I had to see. I rose and approached the door. My hand hovered over the knob, trembling slightly. I hesitated for just a second longer, then twisted it and opened the door. The apartment's dim light spilled into the hallway, illuminating the walls. The air felt heavy, as if the entire space was holding its breath, waiting. But there was nothing there. No person. No movement. Just silence. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stood frozen at the doorway. Nothing was out of place. The hallway was as I'd left it. Yet, as I looked down, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. Lying just next to the door was an old, worn book. My book. The one I used to read as a child, the one I had completely forgotten about. The cover was slightly faded, but I recognized it instantly. I hadn't seen it in years. The pages were dog-eared, the binding cracked in places from age. It was mine. I bent down and picked it up. The smell of old paper filled the air. But there was no note, no explanation, just a book, silent and heavy in my hands. I scanned the hallway one more time, half expecting someone to appear out of the shadows. But the only sound was the faint hum of the building's pipes and the rush of my own heartbeat. Was it a coincidence? A trick of the mind? But then, as I turned back into the apartment, I saw it, a faint imprint on the back of the door. A handprint. No, not a handprint, but something more like the pressure left by something unseen. It looked fresh, as though someone had pressed against it only moments before. And then I heard it again, that whisper, now softer, more distant, but unmistakably familiar. Eliza. This time, it wasn't coming from the other side of the door. It was behind me. I spun around, my breath quickening, my body stiff with fear. The apartment was empty. No one there. Yet, the whisper hung in the air, like a lingering shadow. My heart raced. Something was happening. Something I couldn't explain. And as I glanced back down at the book in my hands, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Something had been waiting for me, and it wasn't finished yet. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. My hands were still shaking, the book clutched tightly against my chest. What was going on? The apartment felt colder now, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the chill from the other side. The silence was deafening. The kind of silence that makes your mind play tricks on you, makes you question if you're truly alone. The whisper came again, but this time it was louder, clearer. Eliza. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was an insistence, a presence, a force I couldn't ignore. I moved quickly to the living room, but every step I took seemed to echo too loudly in the stillness. I turned on all the lights, hoping the brightness would chase away the creeping feeling that something was waiting in the shadows. I went back to the door and closed it, double-checking the lock. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening, it was tied to this place, this apartment, this building. The whisper seemed to be inside, like it was coming from the very walls themselves. For the rest of the night, I tried to do anything to distract myself, but my mind kept returning to the book. I placed it on the kitchen counter, but it felt wrong, out of place in my otherwise modern home. It was a relic of my childhood, a part of me I had buried long ago. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 2 a.m. I needed to sleep. But how could I, knowing that something had been standing just outside my door, something that knew my name? Something that had left that book as a calling card, a reminder of something I hadn't thought about in years. I finally sat down on the couch, trying to calm my nerves, but I couldn't stop thinking about the whisper. And then, as if summoned by my thoughts, it came again, this time so clear, so near I could almost feel the breath on the back of my neck. Eliza. The voice was not from outside the door, not from the walls. It was right behind me. I shot up, spinning around, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, the shadows benign. But something was wrong. The air felt thicker, like the apartment had suddenly shrunk, trapping me in an invisible vice. The corners of my vision seemed to darken, and I felt a weight pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. I turned back to the book. The cover was open now, though I was sure it had been closed before. My hands trembled as I reached for it, my fingers brushing the worn pages. I flipped it open, half expecting some kind of message to appear, some explanation. But there was nothing. No words. No markings. Just blank pages, staring back at me. I glanced up at the clock again. It was 3 a.m. now, but time seemed to have lost its meaning. The longer I stayed in the apartment, the more the whispers grew, more urgent, more desperate. And then I saw it. On the last page of the book, a single word appeared, written in faded ink that seemed to shift before my eyes. It wasn't my handwriting. It wasn't anyone's handwriting I recognized. The letters seemed to form a name. Sarah. I froze. I had no memory of a Sarah in my life, not anyone I had known personally, and certainly not someone who would have written in my book. My pulse raced, and I looked around the room as if expecting someone to materialize out of the shadows. But there was nothing. No sound except for the rhythmic beating of my own heart. I tried to close the book, but the pages wouldn't budge. The ink on that last page, Sarah, was still shifting, as though it were alive. My head swam with confusion. My thoughts raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. And then, in that terrifying moment of realization, the whisper came again, now not just a voice, but a physical presence. It was coming from within the apartment. Eliza, help me. I couldn't breathe. My eyes darted to the door, my only means of escape. But as I glanced at it, something shifted in the dark hallway beyond. I saw a figure standing there, just out of reach of the light. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadows, but I could see enough to know it wasn't human. The outline was wrong, distorted. A twisted version of something I should have known. The whispering voice came again, more frantic. "Eliza, it's too late." I could feel my legs go numb, my body frozen in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but something held me there, paralyzed by fear. And then, the figure took a step toward me, its shadow stretching unnaturally along the floor, like it was reaching for me. The last thing I heard before the world went black was the final whisper, chilling and unmistakable. "Eliza, you've been waiting for me." I woke up with a start, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. The apartment was dark again, still, quiet. My heart pounded in my chest as if it was trying to escape. The book was lying beside me on the couch, its pages closed as though nothing had happened. But everything had changed. I scrambled to my feet, glancing around the room. The shadows seemed deeper than before, the walls closing in. There was no sign of the figure, no trace of the whispering voice. The apartment was exactly as it had been before. But something was different. I was different. I felt it in my bones. I grabbed the book, my fingers trembling as I opened it again. The pages were blank once more, but the name was there, Sarah, on the final page, the ink darker now, more distinct. It wasn't just written, it felt alive, like the name itself was trying to reach out to me. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I rushed to the front door, desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere in my apartment. But as I reached for the handle, I stopped. There, lying in front of the door, was the same book. It was the one from my childhood, the one I thought I had lost years ago. I knelt down, my hand shaking as I picked it up. It was identical to the one I had just been holding, but there was something wrong. The cover was different, older, more worn, like it had been here for a long time, waiting for me. I opened the book, and this time, I saw something that froze me in place. There, written in bold, clear letters, was the name I had been hearing all night. Sarah. And beneath it, a message. A warning. She is here. She will find you. I slammed the book shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Something was happening, something I couldn't explain. The air felt thick, oppressive. The shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I turned around, ready to flee, but the hallway outside my apartment door was no longer empty. The figure was standing there again, closer this time. I could make out its features now. It wasn't human, not anymore. Its face was distorted, twisted, like a mask of flesh that had been stretched beyond recognition. Its eyes were black voids, hollow and empty. Sarah. The voice came again, louder now, more demanding. Eliza, come to me. I backed away slowly, but I knew I was running out of time. I couldn't escape this. Whatever was happening, it was tied to the book, to the name Sarah. I had to face it. The figure took another step forward, and with it, the temperature in the room dropped even further. The walls seemed to close in, and I could hear the echo of my heartbeat, deafening in the silence. Eliza, it's time. The words were like a cold, cruel promise. I didn't know what was happening, but I couldn't ignore it any longer. This wasn't just a nightmare, it was real. I gripped the book tighter, as if it were my only lifeline. And with a final, trembling breath, I made my decision. I had to go to her. I stood there, staring at the figure as it moved toward me. Its presence seemed to warp the space around it, distorting the shadows until they became something monstrous, creeping along the walls. The air was thick with the chill of something ancient, something that had been waiting, patient and relentless. Sarah. The name lingered in my mind, pulling me like a magnet, an inevitable pull that I couldn't escape. It was a promise, a demand. And now, as I stood in the doorway, I realized it wasn't just a name. It was an invitation. I didn't know how to move. My feet felt like they were cemented to the ground. The figure was almost upon me, its hollow eyes now locked onto mine, staring into my soul. It was like being drawn into a deep, endless abyss. I could feel its gaze, not just on my skin, but deep within me. My pulse raced, and my breath quickened, each inhalation like I was swallowing ice. The figure stopped just inches away, and I could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on me. It reached out a hand, its fingers elongated and unnaturally pale, like they were made of something that didn't belong in this world. "Eliza," the whisper came again, a sharp, guttural hiss. "You have always known, haven't you?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. There were no words that could explain what I was feeling, what I was seeing. The walls felt like they were breathing now, pulsing with life, as if the entire building was aware of what was happening. It was as if the apartment, the hallway, the book, it all belonged to this thing. "Come closer." The voice was softer now, almost coaxing. "You've been running for so long, Eliza, but it's time to face the truth." I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear, by confusion. I didn't want to face it. I didn't want to know the truth. But deep down, something inside me knew that I had no choice. This wasn't just some random nightmare. It wasn't just a figment of my imagination. This was real. And this thing, it was tied to me, to my past. I glanced down at the book in my hands. It was still closed, the pages blank once more. But there was a strange pressure building in the room. The book felt heavy, like it was going to explode. And I knew, instinctively, that the key to everything was in those pages. I opened the book again. But this time, something was different. The pages were no longer blank. They were filled with words, dark and twisted. And at the very center of the page, there it was again, the name. Sarah. I didn't have time to read more. The figure took another step forward, its face twisting into something more grotesque. The shadows behind it seemed to pulse and writhe, as if alive. And then, for the first time, I saw the other side of it. There was something standing in the shadow. A form. A silhouette that looked like me. The other me. I stumbled back, my heart racing as I realized the truth that had been haunting me all along. The figure wasn't just a stranger. It wasn't something outside of me. It was me. Or rather, something that had once been me, a part of me that I had forgotten, buried in the corners of my mind. I could feel it now, the connection. The thin, fraying thread that bound us together. The book, the name, the whispers, they were all leading to this moment, this confrontation. "Sarah," the figure hissed, its voice now distorted, as if it was 1,000 voices speaking in unison. "Sarah, you cannot hide anymore." I took a deep breath, gathering the last of my strength, and stepped forward. "I am Eliza," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "I am Eliza, not Sarah." The figure laughed. The sound was hollow, like the echo of 1,000 voices trapped in a well. You don't remember, do you? The girl who was forgotten, the figure's eyes burned with malice. You are Sarah. You always have been. The world spun around me, and the apartment, the hallway, everything around me seemed to warp and twist. I was falling into it, into the darkness that had been waiting for me. And then I understood. This was no longer about running. This was about remembering. I had to confront the truth. But the truth was something I wasn't ready for. The room around me was changing, warping. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew thicker, heavier. Every inch of the hallway felt like it was pressing against my chest, suffocating me. The book I still clutched in my hands trembled, its pages flipping on their own accord, like it was alive, guiding me to something I wasn't ready to see. Sarah, the figure hissed again, its voice like 1,000 whispers curling around my ears. Sarah, come back. You cannot run from your past. I could feel my heart racing, but something inside me shifted. The truth, no matter how terrifying, was unavoidable. I had to face it. I had to know. My trembling fingers reached for the book, but before I could flip the pages back to the beginning, the figure lurched forward. In a sudden motion, it reached for me, and I froze. Its hand was cold, colder than anything I had ever felt. It wasn't just ice, it was something beyond that. Something unnatural. The air crackled with energy, and everything around me seemed to pulse. My vision blurred as the shadowy figure grew larger, its face twisting and contorting until it was no longer human. It was a grotesque, nightmarish shape, stretching and distorting, its form melding with the darkness around it. Its eyes burned with an intensity that made the world feel like it was crumbling. Sarah, the voice repeated, now louder, more insistent. You cannot escape who you were. You are me. Suddenly, a flood of memories hit me. Flashes of a childhood I had buried deep, distant echoes of laughter, faces I didn't recognize, moments I had long since forgotten. I was drowning in them. The confusion, the pain, the sense of being split in two. I gasped for air, but the memories kept coming. They were overwhelming, crushing. There was no escaping the truth. I wasn't just Eliza. I had been Sarah. The girl in the book, the girl I had forgotten, was me. I had erased her. I had abandoned her. And the figure before me was a piece of that forgotten past, a shadow that had been waiting to reclaim me, to pull me back into the life I had fled. The book began to glow faintly, the words on its pages shifting, rearranging themselves into something new. The name Sarah was still there, but it was no longer just a name. It was a curse. A tether. A bond that could never be broken. I felt myself falling into it, into the darkness that seemed to call my name. The figure reached out again, its cold fingers grazing my arm, and I could feel the weight of everything I had left behind dragging me back into the void. But I fought it. I fought for control, for the part of me that still remembered the life I had tried to create. I wasn't Sarah anymore. I wasn't that frightened girl from so long ago. I am Eliza, I whispered, louder this time, my voice shaking but stronger. I am Eliza. The figure recoiled, its grotesque form flickering, as if my words were some sort of barrier. But the shadows around it still swirled, threatening to overtake me. The room was closing in. The darkness was consuming everything. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I knew deep down that I couldn't fight it much longer. But then, in the distance, I heard something. A faint sound. A soft whisper, barely audible. But it wasn't the figure's voice. It was my own. I could hear the name now, clearer than ever. Sarah. And in that moment, everything changed. The shadows receded, the figure fading into nothing. The book snapped shut, its glow dimming as the air around me shifted. The weight pressing on me lifted, and I felt the world slowly returning to its familiar state. But it wasn't the same. Nothing was the same anymore. The memories, the truth, remained, and they would always be a part of me. I stood in the hallway, the apartment quiet once more, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I had seen the truth. I had faced it, and it would never let me go. Have you ever had the feeling that time isn't just a straight line, but a loop that circles back on itself? What if the future and the past weren't as separate as we've been told? What if something from your future could reach back and touch you before it's happened? I was browsing the aisles of the old library one evening when I came across a book that seemed oddly familiar. It was tucked away on a shelf that wasn't usually frequented, buried between more common titles. The book had no title, only a worn cover with a faded pattern I couldn't quite make out. I picked it up on impulse, feeling a strange pull toward it. As I sat at a nearby table and flipped through its pages, something strange happened. A folded piece of paper fell out, landing softly on the table. It was an envelope, yellowed with age, the seal cracked and weathered. I almost didn't open it. Something about it seemed too personal, too intimate, like a letter meant for someone else. But I opened it anyway. The handwriting was neat, familiar. It was my own. The letter inside detailed the next few days of my life with unsettling precision. It described in vivid detail everything I would do, what I would eat for breakfast, the exact moment I would walk out of my apartment, the people I would meet, and even the smallest decisions I would make. The letter didn't just predict events, it captured my thoughts, my feelings, and even my fears. I stared at the paper, heart pounding in my chest. How could this be? I hadn't written this letter. I had never seen it before, yet the words, they felt like mine. The more I read, the more I felt a deep sense of dread creeping into my bones. The letter spoke of an event that would happen in just 3 days, a moment that would change everything. The letter wasn't just describing the future, it was warning me. I could feel a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. The more I read, the more details became unsettling. In 3 days, I would experience something that would make me question everything about reality. The letter mentioned a decision I would make, one I would regret deeply. A choice that would lead me down a path I couldn't turn back from. I quickly stuffed the letter back into the book and rushed home, the weight of its words heavy in my mind. How could this be possible? A letter from the future? My future? It didn't make sense. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, that maybe someone else had written it as a cruel joke. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something in me was already changed. Over the next few days, I tried to go about my normal routine, pretending nothing was different. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that every step I took was being guided by some unseen hand. The letter had come to life in my mind, its words echoing in my head, urging me to follow its predictions. But it was no longer just a warning. It was a command. I could feel the tension building, the sense of impending doom weighing on me. Each moment felt like it was leading me toward that moment of decision, the one the letter had described in such detail. The closer I got to that moment, the more everything around me seemed to change. The air felt thicker, heavier. The streets, which had once been so familiar, now seemed alien, full of strange faces and unsettling sounds. And as the days passed, I began to notice something else. Things around me were starting to happen exactly as the letter had predicted. The people I would meet, the conversations I would have, they all unfolded as though the letter had already mapped out every step of my life. The events were unfolding with terrifying accuracy. But it wasn't just the future that the letter had described. It was also what would come after. The letter warned of a moment when I would have to make a choice. A choice I would never be able to undo. And as I sat in my apartment that evening, staring at the book that had started it all, I realized that the letter was more than a prediction. It was a trap. But how could I escape it? How could I change what was already written? The next few days passed in a blur of confusion and dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking in a shadow, following the letter's predictions like an invisible leash. The world felt strangely distant, as though I were observing my own life from outside my body, powerless to change what was happening. I couldn't go back to the library. I couldn't open that book again. But somehow, the letter had already changed everything. The sense of inevitability was crushing. No matter what I did, it felt as though I was bound to the path it described. The choices I made, the steps I took, they all led me to the same place, the same decision. A decision that felt wrong, but one I couldn't avoid. The letter had outlined one thing very clearly. The choice would come at the end of the week, on a Thursday evening. By then, it would be too late to change my mind. I would have already committed to it. The warning became more pressing with every passing hour. The letter was right. The world around me was shifting, as though it were being rearranged to fit its narrative. I began noticing strange things, tiny details that seemed off. A clock in my living room that always ran a few minutes ahead, a strange noise in the walls that I couldn't explain, even though I had lived in the apartment for years and never heard it before. People in the street would glance at me a little too long, as though they knew something I didn't. It wasn't just the atmosphere. It was my own thoughts. I felt like I was losing control of them. They were becoming more and more in line with the letter's predictions. The worst part was that I couldn't even remember when my thoughts stopped being my own. When did the letter's words start to shape my decisions? When did the line between my will and the letters will blur? It was Thursday evening when I reached the moment described in the letter. I stood at the door of my apartment, frozen, as if waiting for something or someone. The letter had described this moment with chilling accuracy, the same way it had described everything that had come before it. It said I would hesitate, uncertain of what to do next. It said I would feel like there was no way out, that the choice was inevitable. I couldn't breathe. In the letter, it said I would walk out the door, that I would walk down the hallway and through the lobby of my building, and I would meet someone there. It didn't say who, just that this person would play a part in the decision I was about to make. I stepped out into the hallway, heart pounding. The silence was deafening. The hallway was empty, as usual. I walked toward the elevator, my footsteps echoing in the otherwise still building. I paused, staring at the closed doors, wondering if I was truly alone or if the person from the letter was already waiting somewhere. But when the elevator doors opened, there was no one inside. I had to get out of there. I stepped into the elevator, my finger trembling over the button to the ground floor. But just before I pressed it, a sound made me freeze. A faint noise, almost like a whisper, came from behind me. I spun around, heart racing. The hallway was empty. There was no one there. But I could have sworn I heard something. It was so soft, so quiet, almost like someone was calling my name from far away. But there was no one in sight. I quickly pressed the button, and the elevator doors slid shut, cutting off the sound. I breathed a sigh of relief, but the air felt colder now. The elevator descended slowly, as though weighed down by something unseen. When the doors opened on the ground floor, I stepped out into the lobby and was greeted by a strange sense of déjà vu. Everything looked the same, just as the letter had said it would. I could feel the presence of someone watching me. My stomach turned. And then I saw him. The man from the letter. He was standing near the entrance, his back turned to me. I knew who he was even before he turned around. I knew because the letter had told me everything about him, the way he would dress, the way he would smile, the way he would speak. I knew the exact words he would say. I knew the choice he would give me. But just as I was about to approach him, something stopped me. A sudden, overwhelming feeling of dread. I couldn't do it. I couldn't walk any further. I turned, my feet moving faster than my mind could process, and fled through the doors of the building into the cold night air. I didn't look back. I didn't return to the apartment that night. I couldn't. The weight of the letter's words, the image of the man standing in the lobby, and the whispers I had heard in the elevator, they all haunted me. My mind was a maze of confusion, desperately trying to make sense of what was happening, but no answers came. The more I thought about it, the less I understood. I wandered the streets aimlessly until the early hours of the morning. The city, which had once felt so familiar, now seemed foreign. Every shadow, every sound felt like a warning. The letter wasn't just predicting events, it was controlling them. I could feel it, like a tight grip around my chest, suffocating me with its inevitability. I couldn't even trust my own thoughts anymore. They weren't my own. The letter had already dictated everything. My steps, my actions, they were all following its path. The more I tried to resist, the more I felt like I was sinking into its pull. By morning, exhaustion had taken over, and I found myself back at the library, the place where it all began. I didn't even know why I came. Maybe I was hoping that if I returned the book, the letter would stop following me, that somehow I could break free from its grip. But as soon as I walked through the doors, I knew it was hopeless. The library felt different now. The air was thick, as if something unseen was waiting, watching. I walked through the aisles, my eyes scanning the rows of books, but none of them seemed familiar anymore. None of them felt safe. I found this section where I had picked up a book before. It was empty. The shelves, usually so full of dusty tomes, were bare. I couldn't see the book anywhere. Panic surged in my chest. How could it be gone? It had to be here. It was the only thing that had ever felt real in the midst of everything falling apart. But the shelves were empty. I turned and stumbled back toward the entrance, my breath quickening. I needed to get out of there. The letter had already changed everything. The path was set. But before I could leave, I saw it, a figure, standing at the far end of the library. The man from the letter. He was watching me. My heart stopped. I had seen him in the lobby, but seeing him here, in the library, felt like a violation. It was as if he had come to take me back, to force me to fulfill the prophecy that the letter had laid out for me. I turned to run, but something stopped me. The letter had said this would happen. It had said the man would follow me everywhere, that he would always be one step ahead, pushing me toward that inevitable moment. And now, standing here in the library, surrounded by empty shelves and silent air, I realized something else. The letter wasn't just predicting the future, it was creating it. It wasn't just a warning. It was a guide. A map of my life that I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried. I stood there, frozen in place, staring at the man. He didn't move. He didn't speak. But I could feel his presence, a dark shadow that hung over me like a storm cloud, waiting for the right moment to strike. I had no choice but to approach him. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward him, my heart pounding in my chest. The air around me felt heavy, suffocating, as if the library itself was closing in. As I walked closer, I could hear his voice in my head, the same words that had been written in the letter. It was as though the letter had prepared me for this moment, that everything had been leading up to this. And in that moment, I understood the truth. There was no escape. The letter had already decided my fate. When I was close enough, he finally spoke. "Are you ready?" His voice was soft, almost gentle, but it sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to scream, to run, but my mouth was dry. I couldn't speak. The words I wanted to say were stuck somewhere deep inside me, buried by the weight of what was coming. "I'm not ready," I whispered, the words barely escaping my lips. But I knew, deep down, that it didn't matter. It was already too late. The man's gaze never wavered. He simply stood there, his eyes locking onto mine as if waiting for me to understand. The silence between us felt like an eternity, filled with unspoken words, a pressure that weighed heavy on my chest. "I'm not ready," I said again, my voice trembling, the words thin, fragile against the suffocating quiet of the library. His lips curled into a faint smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. He took a step closer, his movements smooth, calculated. "You don't have a choice," he said, and I felt his words like an icy hand around my heart. I tried to step back, to turn and run, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. The world around me seemed to warp, to bend in ways that were impossible to explain. The shelves behind me blurred, and the walls of the library, once so comforting, now felt like they were closing in, trapping me in this impossible moment. "You've been following the path set for you," he continued, his voice calm, too calm. "The letter was only the beginning. And now, you've arrived at the end." I wanted to shout, to scream for help, but the library was silent. No one else was here. Only the two of us. And the weight of the letter's prophecy hung in the air like a fog, so thick it was suffocating. I wanted to deny it, to run, but deep down I knew it was true. The letter had been right about everything so far. Every word, every prediction had come true. And now, as I stood face to face with the man, I knew that whatever was coming next, it had already been written. "Why me?" The words slipped out before I could stop them. "Why did you choose me?" He tilted his head, the smile on his face never faltering. "You weren't chosen," he said softly. "You were simply part of the story. The letter chose this place, this time, this moment. And you were only the one who happened to be in its path." I could feel the panic rising in my chest, a wave of suffocating dread. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice shaking, but I already knew the answer. The letter had shown me this. The man had shown me this. "Now, we follow the final step," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "And there is no turning back." I felt the coldness in his words, the certainty that there was nothing I could do to change the course of events. I was stuck, trapped in this nightmare with no way out. The letter had already planned my fate, and I was powerless to resist. The man took another step closer, and this time I could feel the coldness radiating from him, an unnatural chill that seeped into my bones. "Do you understand now?" he asked, his voice barely more than a breath. I nodded, but the fear in my chest tightened with each passing second. I didn't want to understand. I didn't want to accept this reality. But I had no choice. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper, another letter. My heart raced as I saw it, recognizing the handwriting immediately. It was my own. "This," he said, holding it out to me, "is your final message. It's the last part of the story." I reached for the letter with trembling hands, unable to stop myself. As my fingers touched the paper, I felt an electric jolt run through me, like a shock, a warning. I unfolded it slowly, almost afraid to read the words that awaited me. And as I read them, I felt my world crumble around me. It wasn't just a message. It was a command. "Leave the library," the letter instructed. "Leave now, or you will never leave at all." I froze. The words were clear. The choice was mine. Leave or stay and become part of the library's eternal darkness. The man watched me intently, his expression unreadable. I turned, my heart pounding in my ears. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move, to take a step toward the door. But as I did, I heard something that made me stop cold. The sound of the door locking. I spun around, panic rising in my throat. The man was gone. The library, once vast and open, now felt like a cage. The walls seemed to press in on me, and the air was thick with dread. I rushed to the door, my hands shaking as I tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. "Let me out!" I screamed, slamming my shoulder against the door. But the door didn't give. It was locked. I had no way of knowing how long I struggled with it. Minutes? Hours? Time didn't seem to exist here anymore. The library had become my prison. And then, from the corner of the room, I saw it. A shadow moving. No, not a shadow, a figure. The man was back. "Ready to follow the last step?" he asked, his voice calm, like nothing had changed. I backed away, my eyes wide with terror. He was here. He was real. And the letter had predicted this, just like everything else. There was no escaping. I was trapped. The room felt smaller now, the air thick with the kind of silence that drowns out every sound, even the beating of my own heart. I could hear the thumping in my chest as if it were the only thing left in the world, and it terrified me. The figure in front of me, the man, moved slowly, deliberately, his presence overwhelming, like a shadow that stretched far beyond the confines of the room. Every step he took was a step closer to sealing my fate. "You knew this was coming," he said, his voice barely a whisper, yet it carried through the room as if it were the only truth left. "You always knew." I shook my head, backing further into the library's corner, my hand still gripping the doorknob, though I knew deep down it would do nothing. My throat was dry, my breath short and shallow. I couldn't escape. The letter had promised me that. And now, here he was, part of the story, part of the end. "No," I croaked. "I never asked for this. I didn't choose it." "Ah, but you did." His lips curved into a smile that didn't reach his eyes, that never reached the depths of his cold stare. "You've been following the path of the letter, each step leading you to this moment. The door is already closed. There's nothing more to decide." I wanted to scream, to run, to break free of the web of inevitability that had entrapped me since I first found that letter. but my body refused to move. My legs were frozen in place, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and terror. What do you want from me?" I managed to ask, my voice breaking. The question felt foolish, even as it left my lips. I already knew the answer. The man was part of the story. The letter was part of the story. And now, I was part of the story too. The man stepped closer, his shoes making no sound against the floor, as though he were drifting, not walking. "You already know," he replied. "This is the end. This is the final chapter." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, knocking the air from my lungs. I wasn't just reading a letter, I was living it. Everything I had read, every word I had followed, was coming true, unfolding before me in this very moment. He reached out, placing his cold hand on my shoulder. I shuddered at the touch, but my body didn't recoil. I couldn't. I was trapped in this moment, in this space, in this story. His grip tightened slightly, but there was no force. It was as if his touch itself was an anchor, binding me to the truth I had tried so hard to avoid. "There's no turning back now," he said softly, his breath cool against my ear. "The letter has shown you your fate. And fate doesn't give second chances." I wanted to say something. Anything. But the words wouldn't come. The library, once a place of knowledge and comfort, now felt like a tomb. The walls, the books, even the air seemed to close in on me. I felt suffocated by the weight of what was happening, what had been set in motion long before I even picked up that book. The letter. The man. The locked door. It was all too much. "You've read the final lines," the man said, his voice quiet but sure. "And now, you understand. You are part of the story, whether you want to be or not." I nodded, though the words felt distant, as if they weren't my own. The terror of it all, the impossibility of it, left me hollow, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled by someone else. There was no escape, no way to change what had been written. The man smiled again, and this time there was something almost pitying in his expression. "It's time to finish it," he whispered. And with those words, the library around me began to shift. The shelves, once static, seemed to breathe, their rows of books swirling like smoke, blurring together as though they were part of something much larger, something I could no longer comprehend. The world was collapsing, folding in on itself, the story closing in like the final pages of a book. And then, the darkness took over. It was not the blackness of the night, but something far deeper, something that filled the space of my mind, my thoughts, my very soul. When I opened my eyes again, the library was gone. There were no books, no shelves, no door. Only a mirror. And in the reflection, I saw the man. He was standing there, his expression calm, like he had been waiting for me all along. And I knew then, in the deepest part of my being, that the letter had been right. The story had ended. But it wasn't over. Not for me. Not for anyone. Have you ever noticed something in your home, something that felt out of place, but when you went back to check, it was gone, like it had never been there at all? I had always thought that I was just overthinking things until it happened to me. It was a simple morning like any other. The hum of the elevator as it carried me up to my apartment floor, the smell of freshly brewed coffee from the neighbor's door, the same faces I passed in the hallway. But on this particular day, something felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but as I made my way down the familiar corridor of my building, I noticed it. A door, no, not just a door, an entire apartment was missing. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the empty wall where there should have been a door. The number on the wall, the small brass plate with the number 3B, was gone too, replaced by the smooth, unbroken surface of the wall. I blinked and stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. It was as if it had never existed. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I had misremembered, maybe the apartment had always been here, or maybe it was just a trick of my tired mind. But as I stood there, my mind began to churn. I was sure it had been there yesterday, just a few feet away. It had always been there, and now, nothing. It wasn't just the door, it was the entire apartment. The hallway felt colder, somehow empty. I turned around quickly, wanting to shake the feeling of unease that crept up on me. But as I glanced down the hall, I saw that the other tenants hadn't noticed anything strange. I saw Mr. Keller, the elderly man from the 3rd floor, walking toward me with his cane, smiling as he approached. "Good morning, Miss Thompson," he called out cheerfully. "Good morning, Mr. Keller," I replied, forcing a smile, but my thoughts were elsewhere. I couldn't stop thinking about that door. That apartment. Had I imagined it? "Have you seen the new tenants?" "I hear they're moving in soon," Mr. Keller continued, clearly unaware of my growing discomfort. I nodded absent-mindedly. "I haven't." "Which apartment?" 3B, of course. "The one next to yours." "That's where I saw them last." "I think they're repainting." He paused, adjusting his glasses. "Funny, though. I haven't seen anyone for a few days." I felt a cold shiver run through me, a sharp, unsettling sensation that made my stomach twist. "What do you mean?" "Well," Mr. Keller scratched his head, "I haven't seen them move anything in for a while now. But I did see a couple of young people going in a few days ago. They seemed in a hurry, and I haven't heard a peep since. Strange, isn't it?" He chuckled, oblivious to the unease in my eyes. "That door's been vacant for a long time, though." The smile on my face faded. I couldn't explain it, but the words vacant and new tenants didn't seem to fit together. I had seen that door just yesterday, or was it the day before? No, it had to have been there. I excused myself and quickly retreated to my apartment, my mind racing. I closed the door behind me, leaned against it, and stared at the hallway through the peephole. But there was nothing. Just the usual hum of life in the building, neighbors coming and going, the soft sound of a television echoing from the apartment next door, the muffled sound of footsteps. But in the quiet, I felt a growing dread. What was happening? The hours passed, but I couldn't shake the thought of the missing apartment. I kept trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, but then, at odd moments, I would hear it. A low, distant hum. Not from the elevator, not from any of the neighbors' doors. It was coming from the direction of the missing door. It was faint at first, a whisper on the edge of hearing, but it was there. The hum, the buzz, something that didn't belong. As night fell and the building grew quiet, the sound seemed to grow louder, more distinct. And that's when I heard something that froze me in place, footsteps. Faint, soft footsteps, coming from the direction of the wall where the door should have been. My heart hammered in my chest as I pressed my ear against the wall, the cold surface sending a shiver down my spine. The footsteps continued, slow, deliberate, like someone pacing, waiting. My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled back from the wall, my mind racing. Was I hearing things? Could someone be in there? Had someone always been in there? I wasn't sure. But I knew one thing for certain, something in this building wasn't right. I had to find out what was going on with that missing apartment. But as I stood there in the darkness of my apartment, the footsteps continued and the hum grew louder, closer. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. Not in the building. Not even in my own mind. The night stretched on, thick with an unsettling silence. The footsteps, which had once been faint and distant, now reverberated in the walls of my apartment. Every time I tried to breathe, the air seemed to thicken, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I couldn't sleep. The thought of the apartment that had vanished haunted me, gnawing at the edge of my thoughts like a persistent whisper. How could a whole apartment just disappear? There had to be a logical explanation, a reason for this strange phenomenon. But the more I tried to reason with myself, the more the unease grew. Nothing in this building felt quite the same anymore. The next morning, I decided to take a closer look. I couldn't just ignore what was happening. I had to find answers. But as I approached the hallway, my stomach twisted into knots. The air felt heavier, thick with a sense of something wrong. I reached the spot where the missing apartment should have been and paused. The wall was smooth, pristine. There was no trace of any door or window, nothing that suggested it had ever existed. I ran my fingers along the surface, half expecting to feel a cold draft or some hidden seam where the door might have been. But there was nothing. Just the same unyielding plaster. You're just imagining it, I muttered to myself, trying to calm the panic rising in my chest. But the footsteps had stopped. The silence was so thick that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I stood there for a long time, feeling both stupid and terrified, until I finally turned away. But then, something caught my eye. A small, crumpled piece of paper was wedged between the baseboard and the wall. I bent down to pick it up, my fingers trembling. The paper felt old, brittle even. I carefully unfolded it, and my blood ran cold when I saw the handwriting. It was my handwriting. I hadn't written this. At least, I didn't remember writing it. The ink was dark, sharp, and familiar, too familiar. The words on the page were chilling. I see you standing there. You should have left when you had the chance. There is no escape. The door will not come back. My hands shook violently as I read the words over and over. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was mine, but I didn't remember writing it. I didn't even know why or I could have. The words felt like they were seeping into my thoughts, taking over my mind, making my fear grow. Suddenly, I felt a cold draft brush against my skin, and I spun around, expecting to find someone standing behind me. But there was nothing. Just the empty hallway stretching out in both directions. The sound of my breathing seemed louder than ever as I backed away from the wall, clutching the paper in my hand. I bolted back to my apartment, slamming the door behind me. My mind raced. The paper. The footsteps. The missing apartment. It was all connected. I didn't know how, but it was. The question gnawed at me, what was happening in this building? And why was I being drawn into it? The more I thought about it, the more I realized I wasn't the only one who noticed something wrong. Over the next few days, I began to speak with other tenants, trying to gather any information that could explain the mystery. But every time I mentioned the missing apartment, the reaction was the same. People looked at me as though I had lost my mind. Apartment 3B? That's been vacant for years, one of my neighbors, Mrs. Ackerman, told me. Her voice was flat, indifferent. "I don't know what you're talking about. There's no such apartment." But I had seen it. I had heard the footsteps. It was real. I was sure of it. I tried to press the issue, but the more I asked, the more people seemed to avoid the topic. It was as though they didn't want to acknowledge it, as if speaking about it might bring some kind of curse upon them. Every time I approached anyone with questions, they either changed the subject or became visibly uncomfortable. It was clear they knew something, but no one was willing to share. And then, one evening, I heard something different. A knock. It was soft at first, barely audible. I froze, staring at the door, my heart racing. I couldn't tell if it was my imagination playing tricks on me, but it sounded real. A second knock followed, then another. I moved toward the door cautiously, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Whoever it was, they were persistent. And for some reason, I felt a strange, irrational sense of dread creeping up my spine. I opened the door, just a crack, peering out into the hallway. No one. Just the same empty corridor. But then, I noticed it. The door across from me, the door that had always been there, was now cracked open, just a little. It had never been open before. I stepped out into the hallway, my breath shallow. I approached the door slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. As I reached for the doorknob, I heard it again. The soft murmur of footsteps, faint but distinct, coming from the room. I pushed the door open, my heart in my throat. Inside was an apartment, but it wasn't the apartment I remembered. It wasn't the one I had seen just days ago. The walls were cracked, the furniture covered in a thick layer of dust. It looked abandoned. And yet, it felt wrong. Like something was waiting in the dark corners, watching. And then, on the table in the center of the room, I saw it. A piece of paper. Just like the one I had found earlier. It was folded neatly, addressed to me. And my name was written on it in the same sharp, familiar handwriting. I stared at the folded piece of paper on the table, a sick feeling pooling in my stomach. The handwriting on the outside was unmistakable. It was mine. The very thought of it made my skin prickle, as though the words written on it weren't meant for me, but for someone else. Or something else. Slowly, almost against my will, I stepped forward. The air inside the apartment was cold, too cold for a place that had been unoccupied for who knows how long. My breath came out in small clouds, and the silence seemed to press in on me from all sides. I reached for the paper, hands trembling as I picked it up, unfolded it, and read. You came looking for answers. But some questions should never be asked. I froze, unable to comprehend what I was reading. There was no other text, no explanation, nothing to guide me through this madness. It was as if the room itself was playing a cruel joke, teasing me with hints I couldn't grasp. I quickly shoved the letter into my pocket and turned to leave. My mind raced with 1,000 questions, but there was no time to think. I could feel a presence behind me. It was subtle at first, like a shift in the air, a whisper in the silence. The feeling crawled up my spine, making the hairs on my neck stand tall. I needed to get out of there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The door slammed shut behind me with a force that sent a jolt through my body. I whipped around, breath catching in my throat, but there was nothing, no person, no shadow. Just the echo of the door's movement in the empty hall. I quickly turned the handle, only to find that the door wouldn't open. It was as though the lock had shifted, as though something inside the room had blocked me out. The handle wouldn't budge. I pounded on the door, my fists crashing against it in desperation. "Let me out!" I shouted, but my voice seemed to disappear into the walls, swallowed by the oppressive silence. I paused, listening for any sign of life, any sound to break the unbearable quiet. But there was nothing. A strange noise suddenly filled the air, so quiet at first I almost thought I was imagining it. A low humming sound, like the whirring of machinery in the distance. It grew louder, closer. My breath quickened as the noise surrounded me, becoming an almost physical presence in the room. I backed away from the door, my chest tight, my heart pounding in my ears. The walls felt as though they were closing in, the hallway outside pressing in on me. I turned and stumbled through the dark apartment, my mind racing. What was happening? Why couldn't I escape? Why had the door appeared, only to vanish again when I tried to leave? I ran back toward the living room, hoping to find another exit, another way out. But as I passed by the windows, I stopped dead in my tracks. I was still inside the building. Outside, the city was gone. All I could see was the darkness, an endless void that stretched out beyond the windows. There was no sign of the streets, no lights from other buildings, no cars passing by. Just an endless blackness, swallowing everything. I couldn't breathe. My pulse thudded in my ears as I spun around, desperately searching for something, anything that could explain what was happening. And then I saw it. The hallway, the very one I had walked down earlier, now seemed to stretch on forever. The doors on either side blurred, melting into the walls, disappearing into the shadows. The hallway wasn't just longer than I remembered, it was changing, warping, as though it were bending to some unseen force. The sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor again, but this time it wasn't just faint, it was real. Real and getting closer. I pressed myself into the corner of the living room, trying to make myself as small as possible. My heart raced. Whoever, or whatever, was making those sounds was getting closer. I could hear the soft scraping of shoes against the floor, the slow, deliberate steps as they drew nearer. The door to the room suddenly creaked, the hinges groaning in protest as it swung open. I turned and froze. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure, tall, shrouded in darkness, its face hidden by shadows. I couldn't make out any details, couldn't see its eyes, but the presence was unmistakable. It was there. And it was waiting. The footsteps stopped. The silence, heavier than ever, settled between us. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to move. It was as if something had rooted me to the spot. The figure stepped forward. And in a voice that sent a chill down my spine, it spoke. "Did you really think you could escape?" I tried to speak, but the words stuck in my throat. The figure took another step closer, and I felt the weight of its gaze, though I couldn't see its eyes. The air around me felt colder, thinner. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from behind me. I spun around in time to see the window shatter, the glass splintering into the room, but there was no time to react. The figure moved, its shadow seeming to stretch across the walls. And then everything went black. I woke up to a sudden jolt, my body tense and my breathing shallow. My eyes flew open, and I gasped for air, as if I had been holding my breath for an eternity. But I wasn't where I had been before. The dark, oppressive room was gone, replaced by something different, something far more unnerving. I was sitting on the floor of what appeared to be an empty hallway. The walls were cracked, the ceiling peeling in places, as though this part of the building had been abandoned long ago. The faint smell of dust and mold hung in the air, mingling with the metallic tang of something else I couldn't place. I slowly stood up, my legs shaky, and brushed the dust from my clothes. I was still in the building, I realized, but it was no longer the same. The hallway stretched out in both directions, each one darker than the other. The light fixtures above me flickered intermittently, casting brief moments of clarity before plunging everything back into shadow. It was as if I had stepped into another world entirely, one that twisted and bent under the weight of forgotten memories. I took a cautious step forward. The sound of my shoes against the floor echoed too loudly, as if the space itself was alive, listening. My fingers tingled, my skin prickling with the sensation of something just out of reach, something watching, waiting. I glanced over my shoulder. The doorway I had been thrown through was no longer there. Just a smooth wall, solid and unyielding, as if it had never existed. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Where am I? I whispered to myself, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. The silence in the hallway was suffocating. No sound, no movement. It was like a forgotten place, suspended in time. Yet, I could feel it. Something had changed. Something was here. Something that didn't belong. I took another step forward, my pulse quickening, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The floor beneath my feet groaned as if the building itself was protesting my presence. A chill crept up my spine as I glanced at the doors lining the hallway. Each one appeared identical, aged, weathered, and locked. But something about them seemed off. Some of them had faint markings, scratches, that looked as though they had been etched into the wood by something sharp. Something desperate. I reached for the closest door, my hand trembling as I turned the handle. It opened with a low creak, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Inside, there was a desk with papers scattered across it, the remnants of a life left behind. But what caught my eye wasn't the desk, or the room itself. It was the book. It lay open on the desk, its pages yellowed with age, but the words, those words, were so familiar. I stepped forward, my breath catching in my throat. It was the same book. The one I had seen in the apartment, the one I had thought I'd left behind. The one I had loved as a child. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the pages. The air around me shifted, the temperature dropping. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I froze. A voice, whispered, barely audible, echoed in my ear. "Don't read it." I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty. I swallowed hard, my heart hammering in my chest. What was going on? Why was everything happening like this? Why was I seeing things I shouldn't? I had to keep going. I had to find out what was happening before it consumed me completely. But as I looked back at the book, I saw something new. A small, handwritten note in the margin of the page. It was written in the same handwriting as before, mine. "You've already read it once. But now, the story will change." The words seemed to vibrate with a strange energy, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. I closed my eyes, willing the words to disappear, but when I opened them again, they were still there, as though mocking me. Suddenly, I heard the soft sound of footsteps in the hallway. The unmistakable scrape of shoes against the floor. I turned, heart leaping into my throat. The figure was back. It stood in the doorway, the shadows clinging to its form like a dark shroud. I could barely make out its features, but I knew it was the same presence that had haunted me before. It was here again, closer this time, its cold gaze pressing against me like an invisible weight. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice shaking despite my attempts to stay calm. The figure didn't respond. It simply took a slow, deliberate step forward, and then another. It moved with a strange fluidity, as if it didn't belong to the physical world. I backed away, my breath ragged in my chest. There was no escape. No way out. The hallway seemed to stretch farther and farther, the walls closing in around me with every step. I ran. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just had to get away from that thing. From whatever it was that had been following me, tormenting me. But when I turned the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, at the far end of the hallway, was the door. The door that shouldn't be there. The one I'd seen earlier. The one that had vanished. And in front of it stood a figure. It was me. I froze. My mind couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. The figure standing in front of the door wasn't just any person, it was me. But it couldn't be. I had been running, terrified, and now here it was, a mirror of myself, standing there, unmoving, staring at me with cold, empty eyes. The air around me thickened. I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears, each beat a reminder of the impossibility of what I was witnessing. My body screamed at me to run, to turn away, but my legs refused to move. I stood there, paralyzed, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure. I didn't speak. It simply lifted a hand, slowly, deliberately, and pointed at the door behind me. I glanced at the door. The one that had vanished before. Now it was there again, real and solid. But the instant I looked back at the figure, I felt a presence, its presence growing more intense, more insistent. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare at that door and the figure standing between me and it, as if warning me not to move. A whisper echoed through my mind, distant at first, then growing louder. "You're not supposed to open it." The words seemed to wrap around my thoughts, squeezing them tighter. I had no idea who was speaking. Was it the figure? Was it something else entirely? But the voice felt strangely familiar, like an echo of my own thoughts, my own voice. I took a step back, my hand reaching instinctively for the door handle behind me. The moment I touched it, I felt a sharp chill race up my spine, a coldness that cut through my very bones. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply watched me, its eyes dark, as though waiting for something. A feeling of dread swept over me, overwhelming every other emotion. I was standing at the precipice of something terrible, something I couldn't fully understand. I didn't want to open the door. I didn't want to face whatever lay beyond it. But at the same time, I knew I had no choice. Something was pulling me toward it, like a magnet, relentless and unyielding. I grasped the handle tightly, my fingers white with the effort. I pulled. The door creaked open. The world behind it was not what I expected. It wasn't another room, nor another hallway. It was a vast, empty void. No walls, no floor, just an endless expanse of darkness. I could feel the weight of it pressing against me, pulling at my very being. The silence was deafening, an oppressive, suffocating kind of quiet that seemed to swallow everything. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was as though the void itself had trapped me in its grasp. "Don't go in," a voice said, but it wasn't the figure, it was my own voice, coming from within the void. I turned, and for the first time, I saw the figure move. It stepped forward, not toward me, but toward the door. Its gaze never left me, but now it seemed almost pleading. "Please," it whispered, and I realized it was no longer my voice. It was something else, something distant and foreign. "Don't open it. You don't know what it will do." I felt a cold shiver creep down my spine. I didn't understand. What was it trying to warn me about? What would happen if I opened the door? If I stepped into the darkness? If I let it consume me? But before I could make sense of anything, something shifted in the air. The door behind me slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls, sending a shock of terror through my body. The figure I was gone. The hallway was empty once again. The walls were bare, the floor quiet, the air thick with silence. I stood there, trembling, feeling utterly alone. And then, something flickered at the corner of my vision. A shape. A shadow. A door. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. The door was back, but this time it wasn't in the hallway. It wasn't in the building at all. It was in my hands. I was holding it. I was the one standing before it now. The door that had been lost, that had vanished, that I had left behind. It was mine. I had opened it. I had stepped into it. And now there was no going back. I had become part of the door. As I stood in the dark void, the weight of everything crashing down upon me, I realized the truth. It wasn't the door that had disappeared. It wasn't the hallway that had changed. It was me. I had never left. I had always been here. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.